I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct that may not hereafter be drawn into precedent.
Those are the words of George Washington, our first president and the subject of this, the inaugural episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast. Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And this is the podcast where we're going to talk all about our nation's dead presidents. Those who are dead now and those who will be dead by the time we get to them.
Well, as you and I both know, there is no way that we get to Jimmy Carter before he dies.
Now, it's going to be episode 39. He's not making it that far.
No, I don't think so.
Depending on when this is released, he might not make it.
Breaking news,
Episode 1.
Former President Jimmy Carter, dead of an overdose of crack cocaine.
Yep. Well, he has a problem. This is our first episode. We're going to talk...
keep building houses. Sorry.
Crack?
Hey, maybe. I mean, he's gonna... Christ, I mean, he's in his 90s. He's wielding a hammer and shit.
Yeah, he's like 96 now.
He's wielding a nail gun. Tim Allen, help.
This is a new podcast. It's our inaugural episode. We're going to be talking a lot about the presidents. Our first subject is going to be George Washington. Our second episode will be about the second president, John Adams, and so on. We're going to take you on a journey through presidential history. And when we're finished, when we get to the end, if you listen to every episode all the way through, you will be entitled to an honorary PhD in American history from the Ivy League university of your choice.
Think about that.
Just go to the registrar's office of, say, Harvard University.
Harvard.
Present them with a signed and notarized affidavit stating that you've listened to the entire Dead Presidents Podcast.
And you're wicked smart.
They'll print you off an honorary PhD right on the spot. You can be called doctor, and you will be able to write prescriptions to yourself for whatever tickles your fancy.
I do it.
You can't get that listening to Mark Maron or This American Life. The Dead Presidents Podcast is the only podcast with Ivy League accreditation.
And that is fact. Hashtag fact.
That's the Dead Presidents Podcast promise. If the registrar gives you any trouble, tell him to call us. We'll set him straight. So who the heck are we, and why do we have this podcast? Well, we're just a couple of dudes who love presidents, have for a long time. I am James J. Hamilton. I am a comedian. I like presidents. I've been a fan of presidents for a long time. Now get a chance to share my love with the people. I remember I was in second grade, and I took a book out of the school library about George Washington. And my teacher noticed my love for this book and encouraged me in it. And she actually had me get up in front of the class and like read from this book to the class when I was like 8 years old. And that was really exciting for me because I knew, and what no one else knew at the time, which was there was a part of this book that described like a happy time in George Washington's life by saying, quote, "Times were gay at Mount Vernon."
Oh, well.
And so, you know, I knew that gay meant happy, but this was second grade.
Well, I mean, he farmed tobacco, so he, like, I guarantee that at Mount Vernon at a given time, the phrase, "It's queer how gay a fag makes me feel," was uttered.
Definitely. So as an 8-year-old, I was really excited to say this in front of the class. Thought I'd get a big laugh. But, you know, I was up there reading, but before I could get to that part, the teacher took over reading for me. And when she got to that part, she said, "Times were happy at Mount Vernon." And that is exactly the kind of whitewashing of history that I hate and that you're not going to hear on this podcast. If times were gay at Mount Vernon, that's what we're going to say.
That's right.
We're not going to sugarcoat it for people with weak stomachs.
That's right.
I've waited almost 30 years to say this, and it's time the whole world knew. George Washington's life wasn't all war and struggle. Occasionally, times were gay at Mount Vernon. Now you know the truth, even though Mrs. Duran tried to sweep it under the rug. Now it's out there. Feel free to move Washington up or down in your all-time presidential rankings as you see fit.
Well, I suppose I should introduce myself at this point. I am Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
Do you like President Steve?
Yes, I do. Okay, so I guess I got a deep delve. All right. Initially, the idea that there was like some dude that like ran the country was fascinating, and I wanted a book on the president, so I got it, and they got me flashcards and shit, and by the time I was in like kindergarten, I had them like memorized, and they used to say I knew them by their hairline. Like, they would cover up the card, and I'd be able to tell who it was. And I don't know, the teachers and shit wanted to put me in like special classes for being wicked smart, and my parents were like, nope. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I've been in the president's all of my like functional life, I would say.
Yeah, Steve and I, we've gone on a bunch of trips to visit different presidential houses and historical sites. I think we've been to probably
A good hunk of them.
a dozen or 15 different presidents' houses on like 10 different trips. We invented the presidential war card game.
We'll
game.
have to do a tutorial on that, maybe a video tutorial on
We'll be
presidential war.
Yeah, we'll
as
be
a bonus.
incorporating the presidential war card game into the podcast at some point, where it's like war with traditional cards. You just turn over a card, whichever's the best card wins. But here, it's we use the presidential playing card deck. So it's each president, and then we add in different categories. So we decide which
You draw your category card, and you base the draw on that. So, let's say, for example, foreign policy is the card drawn. And who do you draw, Jim?
I draw Millard Fillmore.
I draw Woodrow Wilson.
Yep. And then we got to look, if we don't know off the top of our heads what those guys did, we got to look it up and figure it out.
And whose foreign policy was more effective
Yep.
and better, and what was the lasting effect of said foreign policy. That is the basis of the victory.
And we will be drinking profusely while we're figuring all this out.
No doubt.
And by the end, we'll all be winners.
Yeah, that's it. We'll all be winners. And, why don't you tell us why we're going to be drinking the entire time for this particular episode anyway? It's not just the inaugural celebration.
Well, we got George Washington's the main subject of this episode.
Yeah, but we got a little bonus for everybody, don't we?
The other special segment that we planned for the podcast is a top 5 list, and today's top 5 list is the top 5 drunkest presidents. So we're going to be getting into that soon.
Which presidents were the biggest lushes?
So as I said, I'm a comedian. Steve has dabbled in comedy in various forms, as a musician, as a filmmaker. Steve once portrayed John Hinckley in a sketch that we did at a President's Day roast at the Arcade Comedy Theater. I was roast master Abraham Lincoln. John Hinckley ended up saving Lincoln by killing John Wilkes Booth at the urging of Jodie Foster.
Well, the things you do for love.
Yeah.
You push little boys out of towers.
So this podcast is going to present, actual historical information from our amateurish presidential history buff perspective, but
Yes,
also comedic shenanigans of that type.
Sure.
We're going to try to make it fun for
You
maybe
gotta
not,
keep,
maybe
keep
not
it
the
keep
whole
it light, keep it happy, and keep it like they did at Mount Vernon back
Yep.
in the day.
We're gonna
Keep
have
it light,
we're
keep
gonna-
it happy, keep it gay.
We're gonna have a gay time on this podcast.
Yeah.
I was gonna say fun for the whole family, but probably not the whole family.
Yeah, leave the dog outside.
Yeah. We're almost ready to dive into this episode, but before we can begin, we have to do something very important.
And solemn.
We're actually not constitutionally eligible to host this podcast until we do.
That is fact.
We're gonna first administer the podcast host oath of office. It's very important. We're going to Steve, you can go first. Why don't you place your right hand on the Bible?
Well, I'm going to say go with the complete book of U.S. presidents.
That is the Bible of this podcast.
That's right.
So I will administer the oath. Repeat after me. I, Stephen Lincoln Douglas, do solemnly swear
I, Stephen Lincoln Douglas, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of co-host of the podcast
that I will faithfully execute the office of co-host of the podcast
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend this podcast of the United States.
that I will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend this podcast of the United States. And now, Jim,
I'm ready.
we turn to you. Place your hand upon this book. I, James J. Hamilton, do solemnly swear
I, James J. Hamilton, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of co-host of the podcast
that I will faithfully execute the office of co-host of the podcast
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend this podcast of the United States.
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend this podcast of the United States. So help me God. You'll notice that we, in administering the oath, did not prompt each other to say, so help me God.
No.
That's actually not part of the constitutional oath of office. George Washington, the first one to take the oath, added that of his own accord. And ever since then, at least nowadays, the Chief Justice, I believe incorrectly, prompts the President to say it. It should be optional.
It should be. Yeah, the Chief Justice should not do that. And the only president that did not was actually Franklin Pierce.
Interesting. Guess that's why God didn't help him.
Yeah, he wouldn't swear. He wouldn't swear. He said, I affirm.
Yeah.
So I guess that's wrong. He might have said, so help me God. But
Yeah. Well, he didn't get help anyway.
yeah, right, God.
We'll find
wasn't
out a
there
little
for
bit
him.
about that as we move into our top 5 list of the day, which is the top 5 drunkest presidents.
Exciting.
It is.
The top 5 drunkest presidents.
Number 5.
James Buchanan. Renowned for handling large quantities of wine or whiskey without appearing drunk. Preferred top shelf liquor. Actually, he would have JB Scotch sent to the White House in crates of Scotch.
Yeah.
And the initials JB would be on there. And he would
Yeah.
tell everybody, "Oh, that's just something of mine. I'm
It's his
having
own
shipped."
personal brand.
Yeah, that was his own personal property or whatever. He didn't let out that it was booze, but yeah, he would import entire crates of Scotch to the White House.
Buchanan, yeah, he was known for his ability to hold his liquor and not get all fallen down about it.
Yeah, he there's one story where he fell down the stairs in the White House in front of a couple congressmen, but it was blamed on his shoes. But when he was at college at 16, he drank 16 toasts at a July 4th celebration. Now that's America right there. Later, of course, he was suspended for disorderly conduct.
Yeah.
But
He
was
did
it all about the drinking? I mean, we might delve into that in a
He
later
did it up in
episode.
college. I think he He said that in order to be like one of the guys and appear popular, that he went along with all manner of like debauchery and inanity as were popular in colleges at the time.
Yeah. Well, he definitely wanted to impress the guys.
True.
As an ambassador to Russia, he complained that the Russian royalty didn't drink much, but he admired the Russian peasant for drinking enough vodka to kill the devil.
That's Russia for you. Impressive to a drinker like James Buchanan.
It's intense. As the Secretary of State, he threw a little bash with about 300 bottles of wine and 150 bottles champagne in addition to liquor. As I've mentioned before, casks of whiskey, boxes, crates with the J&B brand on there, and he would tell servants at the White House it was just, it's just something I'm having shipped from home.
He'd pick up cases of whiskey on his way home from church. Sunday morning was for God. The rest of the day was for the demon alcohol.
For the demon alcohol, yeah. Just, he was opposed to early prohibition efforts. He had, I mean, eventually he had to quit drinking. Flare-ups of the gout. And probably caused by his own habits.
Yep.
Too bad. But, we'll delve into some of the reasons behind his heavy drinking in a later episode.
Episode number 15 when we get to James Buchanan. Most of the top 5 drunkest presidents, their drinking stories don't necessarily have happy endings.
No, they truly don't. And that brings us to top 5 drunkest president.
Number 4.
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush, the most modern of our drunk presidents.
Not the only modern.
He, he got started at a young age. As an adolescent, he poured vodka into the fishbowl and killed his sister's goldfish.
Brutal.
That was his inauguration into the life. He went to Yale, joined a fraternity. In an infamous incident at the 1967 Yale-Princeton football game at Princeton, a drunken George W. Bush scaled the goalpost,
squirreled right on up there.
He tried to tear it down. He was arrested. He was released only upon promising never to return to Princeton.
Well, he didn't tear it down. He used to be a cheerleader.
Yeah, well, that's what male cheerleadering was in the day.
No,
get trashed and tear down the opponent's goalpost.
Be raucous.
Several years later, he was driving home drunk, crashed into his dad's trash can. When his dad came out mad, he challenged him to a fight. Jeb had to step in and break it up.
Wow. I would have liked to have seen that.
Yep. A historic...
What the hell are you doing, W?
He was not happy with his son. W, he went on, he got a DUI a few years after that in Maine. He was partying all night with an Australian tennis player, taught him how to pick up a beer glass with his teeth and chug it with no hands.
Wow.
He tried to keep up drinking with an Aussie and ended up arrested. Family friend who was in the car with him at the time told the cop, "Don't you know who his father is?" That didn't work. He still got popped for the DUI, but the story didn't come out until just days before the 2000 election.
Oh, how convenient.
Karl Rove said that story breaking cost Bush like several states that may be responsible for the deadlock in the 2000 election.
Yeah.
But it ended up that W won with the help of his running mate, Dick Cheney, who had 2 DUIs of his own.
Right.
That ticket overcame the buzz-killing Gore Lieberman ticket in its puny 0 DUIs. That election was DUIs 3 versus 0.
Yeah.
You see who America went with.
That's it. They went for the DUI hat trick.
Yeah, the ticket they want to have a beer with. It's long been a part of George W. Bush's campaign style. When he was running for Congress in 1978, he threw a Bush Bash campaign event where he offered free beer to attendees.
Wow.
His opponent lambasted him for it. He ended up losing that election, but that was the last election he'd ever lose.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Like, really?
I mean, that was big way back in the day. Like George
course it was.
Washington, that was the campaign style at back in the day.
Oh, stump speeches and hard cider and all that fun
campaign
stuff.
event was free alcohol for all who
And that's
attended.
it. Like, yeah, people loved it.
You're
It
gonna
was-
sit
it
there and
was
listen
like-
to speeches for 3 hours?
Yeah, it was like
You're gonna get tuned
professional
up.
wrestling.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not how things are anymore.
Yeah, too bad.
But Bush, yeah, he had a problem. He realized, he later admitted that by his mid-30s he was drinking routinely with occasional benders. He ended up getting trashed on his 40th birthday, running up a, quote, colossal bar tab. The next day, he woke up with a severe headache and hangover and resolved to quit drinking.
I've been there so many times.
Well, on Bush's 40th birthday, he really finally reached the end of his drinking road.
What?
He found religion, and it was God that saved him from the demon alcohol.
If you were really gonna like put it down to like a presidential candidate that you'd rather have a beer with, and you look at Bush and Gore, if you have a beer with Bush, he's probably gonna like tell you some like fucked up stories about how he was on coke
Yeah.
and like did something crazy. Al Gore would probably just show you a PowerPoint about global climate change,
Yeah.
which would be informative but not as entertaining.
Yeah, I think Hunter S. Thompson told a story that he encountered a young Bush at a Super Bowl party in the 1970s where Bush showed up at a party trying to score cocaine. I think Bush ended up passed out in the bathtub, according to Hunter S. Thompson,
Wow.
who referred to Bush as a gilded coke dilettante.
That is classic Thompson.
And classic George W. Bush, but he reformed his ways and became very presidential by the end.
Yeah. Well, I guess that brings us to Drunkest President number 3.
Andrew Johnson.
So most biographers considered Johnson a moderate drinker for his era. But his political enemies really clinged on to that and called him the drunken tailor. He was a tailor. He had no, he made clothes.
Yep.
That's what he did.
Blue collar guy.
Yeah, pretty much. And he was earned that moniker from one infamous incident, and this was Lincoln's second inaugural. Johnson became the vice president because he was the only Democratic senator to stay loyal to the Union. And he had a cold, and the doctor prescribed whiskey?
Yeah, that was the prescription back in the day.
Yeah, so, like, they were like, oh, we'll just, like, have some whiskey. Well, he overdid it, and, he got, like, really legitimately fucked up. Like, he was absolutely swashbuckled, and he got up there to make his speech.
In the Senate, upon his swearing in as vice president.
And it was just a truly cringeworthy experience where he called out virtually every congressman by name, whether or not he could remember their name. And like, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, such and such from Maine and such from New Hampshire, and what's his name from Ohio? Like, that kind of thing. And he's just going on and on and on, and then he goes into this, it's really well told in the documentary, The American President, where they have, the quotes of the speech read, and it's like, I'm a-coming for to tell you here today. I'm a-coming for to tell you here today that I am a plebeian. I glory in it. And, like, all this and that, and it just goes on, and,
He was supposed
everybody's just embarrassed as shit.
Yeah.
Like, Lincoln's sitting there like, fuck. You know?
Yeah, he's supposed to speak
yeah.
for 5 minutes. He rambles on incoherently for about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Before they, like, drag him off the stage.
Yeah. It was described as, quote, a rambling and strange harangue that was listened to with pain and mortification by all his friends. Another quote, the man is certainly deranged, either drunk or crazy. And future President Rutherford Hayes was in attendance, and he wrote to his wife, Lucy, that, quote, it was lucky you did not come to the inauguration. The bad weather and Andy Johnson's disgraceful drunkenness spoiled it. So that wow. You know, you think of Lincoln's second inaugural, that speech that he gave.
Yep. Classic speech.
That classic speech. And it was the prelude to that.
Man. Everyone's like rolling their eyes at this dumbass becoming vice president. Like, how long was it? A month or two before he became president?
Well, I think that spawned the quote. I can't remember where it came from, but we'll delve into that in episode 17 on Andy Johnson. And there was a quote from a newspaper that said, to think that this impish clown, you know, like, or to think that one frail life stands between this impish clown and the presidency is horrifying a prospect.
Yep.
You know, that kind of thing.
And that prospect became a reality within a couple of months or so.
Well, that's it. Like, very, very
Yeah.
quickly. You're talking March 4th to April...
Something, yeah.
Good Friday. I can't remember the date. I'm ashamed.
Yeah. President Andy Johnson he was impeached. He was placed on trial.
Right.
He famously received news of his acquittal in the impeachment trial and toasted a whiskey celebration with his friends to celebrate his acquittal.
Why not? Hey, I'd probably do the same thing. And of course, after the presidency, he got elected to the Senate. That was a historical first.
Yep.
And he gave a speech from a Nashville balcony where he was allegedly swaying back and forth, almost inarticulate with drink. His two sons were drunkards. One died in a horse accident, probably while under the influence, and they call that
HUI.
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 Horsing under the influence.
It was a big problem at the time.
Yeah, oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, HUIs were...
Johnson's other son killed himself after becoming mired in a prostitution scandal.
Probably drinking.
Yep, the demon alcohol, a curse on the Johnson name.
That's it.
And on the Johnson political reputation.
Unfortunate. And that brings us to Drunkest President
number 2.
Ulysses S. Grant.
Ulysses Grant, infamous for his drinking. He went to West Point. He joined the Army. He acquired his drinking habit during the Mexican-American War, as was common among soldiers at the time. But the thing about, we talked about Buchanan earlier being able to hold his liquor. The thing about Grant is that he couldn't hold his liquor.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that with another one here.
Been said of Grant, it's not so much like how often he drank or how much he drank, but just the effect it would have on him.
Right.
He would have one drink and become immediately flushed and end up embarrassing himself. After the Mexican-American War, he was assigned to a post up in the lonely Pacific Northwest. He got reprimanded for being drunk on duty, and his commanding officer made him write out his resignation with no date on it, meaning if you are drunk again, we're filling in a date on this.
Fill in the date.
And then on another occasion, he was drunk, and rather than face court-martial charges, which he probably would have been, reprimanded but allowed to stay in the Army, he was terrified of having his wife find out that he was in trouble for this, so he resigned from the Army, and he didn't, he went on to have a lot of failed business ventures and was really a total failure until the Civil War broke out and the need for trained military men.
Yeah, that's
came in.
It's really something. He was described to President Lincoln by a critic as a jackass in the original package. He is a poor, drunken imbecile. He is most of the time more than half drunk, and much of the time idiotically drunk.
Yep.
I wonder if that was McClellan that said that.
No, I don't think it was McClellan.
No?
It was somebody else. Like, during the Civil War, Grant started being, he was like a nobody, but he started being pretty successful. He was one of the only generals who would be aggressive and take the fight to the enemy, and he was winning. A lot of the other officers were jealous, and they'd harp on his drinking to try to drag him down.
Bring him down.
But he was the one who was winning. He was the most successful general, and so it was Lincoln who reputedly quipped, "Find out what brand Grant drinks and send some to my other generals."
There we go.
I've read Ron Chernow has the great biography of Grant, and it talks a lot about his drinking, and his enemies would like to accuse him of being like drunk in battle and stuff, but it seemed like he would never actually drink on the front lines or on duty when he has like stuff going on, but anytime he'd go away from the front lines on like furlough or go on a trip, that he'd like have a bender.
Yeah, I read that basically the biggest point of his drinking during the entire war was the siege of Vicksburg, when they were just waiting, shelling.
Just a lot of waiting around.
Really the only time that he got like hammered, fucked.
He'd pledge again and again that he's never going to touch a drop of alcohol, but then whenever a time of like boredom and loneliness would come, he would succumb to the bottle. Times that he had to be away from his wife and just like away from his troops, he'd go on a bender. I think it was in New Orleans after a military parade. He got trashed and fell off his horse, injured his leg.
Wow.
I think there was another occasion where he fell off a wagon. His chief of staff was John Rawlins, who later became a cabinet member, I think. He took upon himself the role of kind of like Grant's sponsor, who would he would like make sure that he would stay away from alcohol, and he'd defend Grant against accusations that he was drinking on duty. When he became president, Grant was always in the public eye, so he was real careful about his drinking at that time, and also his wife was always around. So he'd kind of kept it within reason while he was president. But
yeah, I don't know, man. Based on like photographs, I think if I was Grant, I would be drinking around my wife.
Well,
what a dog.
That's
Oof, oof, oof.
That brings me to the last thing I want to say about Grant's drinking. There's a pretty funny letter. When Grant stopped being president, he went on like a big like trip around the world.
Yeah.
And there's a letter he went to India, and there was apparently an alcohol-fueled incident in India. And there's a letter written by the British Viceroy of India about Grant that I'm going to read from now.
Excellent.
On this occasion, our distinguished guest, the double ex-president of the great Western Republic, who got drunk as a fiddle, showed that he could also profligate as a lord. He fumbled Mrs. A, kissed the shrieking Mrs. B, pinched the plump Mrs. C black and blue, and ran at Miss D with the intent to ravish her. Finally, after throwing the female guests into hysterics by generally misbehaving like an elephant, the noble beast was captured by main force and carried by 6 sailors, which relieved India of his distinguished president.
They're making him out like Monty Python's like Terry Jones as Martin Luther.
The Marine officer reports that when deposited in the public saloon cabin where Mrs. Grant was awaiting him, this remarkable man satiated there and then his baffled lust upon the unresisting body of his legitimate spouse and copiously vomited during the operation.
Good God.
If you have seen Mrs. Grant, you will not think this incredible.
Well, that's true.
So the British Viceroy claims that Grant was vomiting profusely
during
sex with his wife.
Yeah, and like I'm gonna tell you straight up, like that we're gonna continue the top 5 as a trend for the show, and there will probably be an episode on the top 5 best looking first ladies.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just say that Julia Grant will not be on that list.
No.
Definitively. And with that, we finally get down to Drunkest President.
Number 1.
Franklin Pierce. Drinking destroyed Pierce's health. It damaged his public and private image.
He had a lot to drink about.
He had a lot to drink about. He had all of his kids die. Some in youth, and then of course Benjamin Pierce, which was like the light of him and Jane's life, was killed in a horrific train wreck in which the top of his head was crushed right in front of them. And that was like on the way to Washington to be sworn in.
On the way to his inauguration, his 11-year-old son is horrifically killed in front of his eyes.
And his other kids had already died, so like they weren't gonna have any more kids. Like the future of their name, that was it. So devastating. He would drink and gamble with his lifelong friend, famous author of, among other things, The Scarlet Letter, Twice Told Tales, Nathaniel Hawthorne.
And Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a biography of Pierce for his campaign.
That's true. It was an early campaign biography, and Hawthorne was not really keen on doing it.
No.
he really didn't like the idea of trying to write a political biography. He only did it because Pierce was such a good friend.
Yeah.
He was uncomfortable doing it. But it's interesting.
Cool.
I've actually read that. It's interesting. Actually, in 1864, Pierce and Hawthorne went on a trip together, like a little bro weekend.
Yeah.
You know, they would do that occasionally.
Throwing it up.
Yeah, just bro it up. And Hawthorne died on that trip. He was supposedly ill and died in his sleep.
That's what Pierce said.
That's what Pierce said, but I think we at the Dead Presidents podcast would like to introduce a little theory that we cooked up.
Yeah.
That might be probably closer to the truth.
Yeah.
So they were playing a drinking game. And Hawthorne was trying to keep up with Pierce shot for shot. And he paid with his life.
Yeah. That's what you get. You try to keep up with Frank Pierce.
That's it. Like, early on, like, that's what I'd mentioned earlier when we mentioned that Grant could not handle his liquor. Early on, it was said that Pierce could not handle his liquor. Like, he wasn't drinking a hell of a lot. He would just drink some and be, like, totally fucked up. But, like, as he progressed, it, like, he became more and more numb to it.
Yeah, Hawthorne's death was towards the end of Pierce's life, too, when he was really in the home stretch of his drink.
Yeah, beyond the home stretch. You know, it was a sad, dark time. Mm-hmm. I mean, as a congressman in the 1830s, Pierce's wife Jane stayed home in New Hampshire, so Pierce was able to just drink and party unfettered in D.C., which he did quite a bit of. He ran with a really heavy drinking crowd, and when he left the Senate in 1841, he decided, okay, I'm getting fucked up all the time. I need to stop drinking. And he decided he would sign a temperance pledge. That was probably at the behest of his nagging shrew wife. That only lasted until the Mexican-American War, when Colonel Pierce returned to his old habits.
Yeah, both he and Grant were gotten by the Mexican-American War.
That's
can't
true.
Can't be down and campaigning on Mexico without tipping the bottle back a little bit to drown your sorrows.
That's it. And, when he later became president, a friend wrote to James Buchanan saying that Pierce has had a fine reputation, but I deeply, deeply deplore his habits. He drinks deep. My heart bleeds for him, for he is gallant and a generous spirit. He had, needless to say, an unsuccessful presidency, as the North-South split over slavery became more and more serious, and when he left office, Pierce said, quote, "After the White House, what is there to do but drink?" And that is exactly what he did. He literally drank himself to death and succumbed to cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 65.
So young. You guys notice most of the top 5 drunkest presidents came from the same era.
What's that?
No, we got presidents number 14, 15,
17, 18.
Yep. From the years 1853 to 1877, with the brief 4-year respite of Lincoln's presidency, we believe that constitutes the presidential alcoholism era.
Yeah, the age of presidential drunkenness.
No wonder that the 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes, and his teetotaling wife,
Lemonade Lucy,
banned alcohol from the White House completely. After the presidential alcoholism era, it was time to dry out.
Time to dry out and sober up, which is just what we are going to do when we come back with more of the inaugural episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
We'll be talking about George Washington right after this, a word from our sponsors. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by the printing offices of Joseph Cruikshank, which announces the publication of a new book of essays on the culture of silk and mulberry trees, proving that the culture is an object deserving of everyone's attention.
James, I have to confess, before I read this book, I didn't know anything about silk and mulberry trees. Now I grow my own at home. Pretty soon I'm going to be making money, and I'll be selling them.
It's the next big thing. You heard it here first. The printing offices of Joseph Cruikshank with essays on the culture of silk and mulberry trees. It's a must-read.
It is.
Get your copy now.
We're also proud to be sponsored by William Delaney, chemist, druggist, and apothecary, who has a large and elegant assortment of drugs, medicines, shop furniture, surgeon's instruments, and patent medicines, which he offers for sale on very moderate terms, including the following articles, which are newly introduced and not yet very generally known: genuine vanilla, Botany Bay gum, odor or essence of rose. Picture that on the Philly.
Wow.
Spanish extract of bark, and essence of anchovies. I gotta tell you, James, I was feeling a little under the weather recently, not too long before we started this podcast, and, you know, could be the old TB acting up again, but I took some essence of anchovies, and I'm as good as new.
I hear you, Steve. You know, lately I've been putting a little Spanish extract of bark in my coffee each morning.
Oh.
And I tell you, I feel like I could run a marathon without breaking a sweat.
Well, I mean, you only have William Delaney to thank for that, the official chemist, druggist, and apothecary of the Dead President Podcast. Thank you, Bill.
Now, an important message from our sponsor, Joseph Bonsall. Horse thief, $20 reward. There was stolen the night of the 19th a black horse, full 16 hands high, a natural trotter, has a thin mane hanging to the right side, not a lofty carriage, lately shod all round with steel-toed shoes, about 9 years old, hath been used to a team and is a good leader, Whoever takes up said horse and secures the thief so that he may be brought to justice shall have the reward of $20. Can you believe that, Steve? Some low-life son of a bitch stole Joseph Bonsol's horse.
I'm just glad we're getting the word out so that we can catch the filthy bastard and brand his forehead with the letters HT for horse thief.
Listeners, if you see a shady character trotting around on a 9-year-old black horse with a thin mane hanging to the right side, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPrezPodcast. That's Prez with a Z. And that $20 reward could be yours. You can also find out more about our sponsors and see their original ads in newspapers published during George Washington's presidency.
I wouldn't mind finding that $20 myself. See, root out that dirty mongrel. And we're back.
We're ready to take a deep dive into George Washington, our first president here on our first episode. I don't know if you've heard of George Washington before, but if you haven't, you're in for a treat.
You are.
He was quite the president. He was our first president. He also had quite the pre-presidential career, perhaps of all the presidents, the most substantial pre-presidential career.
I would agree with that.
He was born in 1732 to a Virginia family. They were, they were rich landowners, but not super rich. Kind of the lower upper class, so to speak.
Right.
George, his father, died when he was 11 years old. His mother was an old battle axe of a woman.
Oh, she was an old battle axe, wasn't she?
Was very overbearing and complaining.
But Washington had an influence as a youth. Now, let's talk about him a little bit.
Yeah.
Who was Washington's kind of hero coming up as a young buck?
It would probably be his brother Lawrence.
That is correct.
His brother was, I think, about 10 or 12 years older than him. So after his father died, his brother was kind of like a father figure to him. Lawrence was the one who originally owned and named Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was named after a naval commander who Lawrence served under in the Caribbean, I believe.
And George himself was supposedly named after George Eskridge, who,
I think took in George's mother when she was orphaned, and then George.
That's it. Yeah, and
Eskridge
George
was her
George
guardian.
Eskridge was a physician. That they think that maybe that's where he got his first name.
Yeah. So Lawrence, he had tuberculosis. Should have hit up William Delaney.
He should have.
Chemist for the cure.
Yeah, that's too bad. Missed
Instead,
opportunity.
Instead he went to Barbados thinking the
Dry climate.
climate would help him. George went with him there. That was his only trip overseas. George contracted smallpox
Oof.
on that trip. Lawrence ended up dying anyway, given George Mount Vernon. He was a young lad inheriting some wealth, but not much. He was ambitious to be an up-and-comer. He became a surveyor.
Yep, got into surveying.
Which was a big, it was a good profession to have at the time because of all the unsettled land.
Yeah, I can't even imagine actually how difficult that would have been.
Yeah.
Like trying to map out.
Yeah, I don't understand how surveyors work at all, but
Yeah.
young George was figuring it out.
Yeah, he was.
And
with his pal Christopher Gist.
Yeah. All the unsettled land out here on the western frontier. This podcast is recorded near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was the far western frontier of the British colonies at the time. And it got, when you're the surveyor who comes out here, you get first look at all the nice land and kind of potentially first dibs on what land you want to invest in. The whole founding generation of America, land speculation was the big get-rich-quick
That's what you
scheme.
wanted to be doing if you wanted money.
And George found himself on the front lines of that. that also helped him. Yeah, he was commissioned as an officer in the Virginia militia, and around the time Virginia and the British colonies had claims to the land around Pittsburgh, but also the French and the French Empire was trying to claim this land. So the governor of Virginia sent George out here with a contingent to kind of map it out and try to plan a road.
That's going to bring us to pretty much set piece number 1.
The French and Indian War.
Yeah, let's talk about de Jumonville.
Yep. The French and
there was a little something that happened there that Georgie Porgy got into
Yep.
a little bit of trouble over.
The French and Indian War is actually the name for the American theater of war in the 7 Years' War, which was kind of a world war. A world war started by little George Washington.
World War Zero, baby. And that is true. He did.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah,
He started it.
Yeah, he came out here with his, Virginia militia, British colonists, and their Indian allies, and they ran into a contingent of Frenchmen, and things got heated.
Very quickly.
And the British and George Washington, fired upon the French, and their commander, Jumonville, ended up killed.
But it was not just a killing. Like, this was portrayed in the press of the time as a brutal, a cold, a premeditated assassination.
Yeah, supposedly I think Jumonville was wounded, and then the Indian
Finished off by Native American allies.
the Indian chief Half King, who was with Washington at the time,
the Half King.
basically walked up to him and tomahawked him right in the skull, and that didn't
sit well.
didn't rub the French the right way. They sent troops after Washington's men. He constructed Fort Necessity to try to defend himself, but they came under heavy attack from the French.
And that led into a whole new disaster.
Yeah.
Washington's early career is peppered with shortcomings.
Yeah.
And some failures.
Yeah, when they were forced to surrender Fort Necessity, and Washington had to sign off on the surrender documents, which were written in French, which he did not read. And it turned out that what he signed off on, without knowing it, described the killing of Jumonville as an assassination.
Yeah.
So he got in big trouble, in Europe for basically admitting that the British assassinated a guy without intending to admit that.
Yeah. That's hairy.
And that was the beginning of the World War that broke out between the British and French, and then the Austrians and Prussians get involved, and Sweden and Russia and Portugal and Spain, and pretty soon everyone's involved.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Washington's performance during the French and Indian War. What kind of officer was Washington?
Well, he was a colonial officer, which is inferior to a British regular army officer.
That would become a problem.
Yeah, after his first disastrous expedition, the British appointed General Braddock to lead a major expedition against the French in the Pittsburgh area, and Washington was attached to that as, I believe, a colonel, but he was a colonial colonel,
Right.
which was considered inferior to a regular army captain.
Right.
And he did not like that the regular army, captains thought themselves outranking to him.
Yeah. But that's not to say that he didn't respect Braddock. Washington deeply respected Braddock. I think he kind of looked up to him
Yeah.
as a model officer.
He looked up to him until he was looking down on his
him.
expiring corpse
Yeah.
in the disaster that I think is just known as Braddock's defeat.
Yep, that's it.
Where
Braddock's
they were
defeat.
ambushed by French and Indians who fired on the British in what the British regulars considered to be an unfair, hit and run guerrilla type warfare that
Not something that the British Army was used to.
no, but it's something that, frontiersman George Washington understood and would later use
Utilize
to his
to
advantage.
their advantage, yeah.
So Washington ended up, when Braddock got killed, he helped, pull everyone together and retreat orderly. He ended up trying to get a royal commission in the regular British Army and was refused. So he was kind of like soured on the
He was
whole
miffed.
on the whole British thing. He resigned and went back to Virginia to try to, become a successful farmer
Just
and
wanted to chill and farm.
British gentleman.
Some things, just the way things transpire, just can't keep you out of it.
Mhm.
So what ends up happening? Virginia beckons.
Yep. And one of the ways Virginia beckons to Washington is with its most eligible bachelorette, a recent widow, Martha Dandridge Custis.
Oh.
She marries a rich guy, has a couple of kids. He croaks, and now she's holding 1,700 acres.
That is fire for the period.
That's very attractive.
Very attractive. Much more attractive than her, probably. I mean, really. I mean, Washington, and we should maybe take a step back. Washington was not particularly into Martha at the beginning. Washington was harboring feelings for somebody else.
Sally
A
Fairfax.
little lady by the name of Sally Fairfax.
His neighbor and friend's wife, the Fairfaxes, were the big shots of Virginia, and they're actually the one that got George the surveying job. But she was married and couldn't go anywhere.
He was into her nonetheless.
Yeah.
It just didn't work out, and then another bird with a plump bit of cash,
With huge tracts of land.
huge tracts of land, came along, and he pounced on that opportunity, all right. But his pouncing might have been limited, isn't that right, Jim?
Well, in a certain way, yeah.
Yeah.
His pouncing
Because-
there was never any issue from
No.
the pouncing.
No, certainly not. And that likely stems from Washington's having contracted smallpox. It left him infertile. Could he get it up? I don't know. I mean, the guy had a size 13 shoe.
Yeah.
So how big was his dick? I mean, he probably had it. I don't know. If shoe size is any indication, which not always, but I mean, Washington might have just had a big flaccid burden to cart about.
Well, or he could have
I
been
don't know if he was infertile and impotent, or if maybe he was just infertile.
yeah, could have been getting it up, but just firing blanks.
Yeah, you never know.
Free to deposit wherever he wants.
Then yeah, and that is Washington's one of our greatest presidents, and
Yep.
what's interesting about that fact is there's another great president that may have had a similar problem that we're going to talk about later on down the road,
Yep.
and that should prove interesting.
Episode 11.
Episode 11. Spoiler alert. So let's move on to Washington's entering the House of Burgesses.
Yep. George is now, he's an up-and-coming landowner, plantation owner, land speculator. He's got a rich wife. And he gets himself elected to the Virginia Colonial Legislature, which is called the House of Burgesses.
I mean, the guy's pretty much got it all.
Yep.
He's looking good. Despite the fact that he feels shunned by, the mother country, if you will.
Yep. Well, he served 15 years in the House of Burgesses, and he became increasingly shunned, or so he felt, by Britain, and was one of the leaders of developing resistance against the British. And one of the first things that they did was organize like a boycott of British goods, and George was at the forefront of that.
Well, yeah, because things are really starting to come to a head at this point in Washington's career. He's not all that stoked about the way he's being treated, and not just him personally. It's more the idea.
Yeah, everyone's thinking, what do we need Britain for anymore anyway?
We're kind of self-sufficient,
Yeah, they're just holding us back.
and they're kind of fucking us too. And that's not nice, So he realized that there was no way to reconcile what was going on. And he decided he would take a little expedition, and that was kind of compensation for his service. So he decided to go and inspect some land and whatnot.
Yeah, at this time the British were trying to stop the colonists from expanding further westward because they didn't want to spend the money to have troops garrisoning the border. So they want to kind of keep everyone bottled up more on the East Coast. But all these settlers see all this land out here and they want to go out there, and the British are trying to stop them from doing so. So that was one of the major issues, along with taxation without representation, that led to the revolution.
An interesting quote from this time comes from, Washington's he's taking the lead in pressing claims for land from Virginia. That's basically, because people looked at, like, Virginia is my country, Pennsylvania is my country, and he said, quote, "I might add, without much arrogance, that if it had not been for my unremitted attention to every favorable circumstance, not a single acre of land would ever have been obtained."
Yeah. Yeah, the Virginia guys who served in the French and Indian War were rewarded with land, but Washington's the one who went out there and actually staked it out and made sure that it was happening.
But he tried to get his pick of the pick of the crop.
Yep.
Which is only fair. He was doing the work.
Yeah, so at this time things are really coming to a head with Britain, especially up in New England, and that's when the Continental Congress starts to be called, and Washington gets elected as a Virginia delegate to the Second Continental Congress, which is the one that is eventually going to declare independence.
And he's a much respected member.
Yeah, he's one of the big shots of Virginia at the time. And up to this point, the resistance against Britain, the kind of open rebellion, has been mostly in the Northeast. But Virginia is kind of the richest and most powerful colony, so the New Englanders want to kind of tie Virginia to the cause. And so it was John Adams who proposed that George Washington be named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
A wise choice.
Yeah, George Washington...
Eventually. It would prove to be a wise choice. Eventually. We'll talk about that.
he showed up to Continental Congress in a military uniform. He's like standing head and shoulders above everyone else in a military uniform. I think it's one of the all-time classic...
yeah, you're right.
It's the all-time classic incidents of dress for the job you want.
Right. Yeah.
They're looking around like, who's going to lead the army? Well,
this fucking guy.
How about the tallest, most badass-looking guy here
what about this
in a military
dude?
uniform?
impressive size, very imposing figure, and in military garb to show up like that, yeah. Who else were they going to pick?
So,
Certainly not Charles Lee.
no. Yeah, because really there's almost nobody in America at the time who has any legitimate experience leading a huge army.
No.
And Washington was picked not just because he did have some military experience, but also because he was one of the most prominent, political guys
Right.
in the country at the time. I think one of the guys who was almost considered was John Hancock, who had no military experience.
Yeah.
But he was just a big shot,
He was
so
a big
they would
shot.
just give it to him. And everyone, Washington and everyone's kind of just improvising the war and the whole form of government and everything.
Yeah, and it's not that Washington didn't have his enemies. He did. I mean, but it was just the majority was this is the smartest choice we could make.
Mm-hmm. Well, at first, I think he was appointed unanimously and everything. He developed enemies after things started to go wrong. But at the time he got appointed, war had kind of already broken out in Massachusetts with Lexington and Concord, and the British have occupied Boston. And so they send Washington up there to take charge of a ramshackle army.
Yeah. Totally untrained.
Yeah. And pretty soon they bring in the guns of Ticonderoga captured and put them on the Dorchester Heights of Boston, commanding the city and getting the British to evacuate Boston, which was kind of the big opening victory of the war. But unfortunately, the British went from Boston to New York with the biggest expeditionary force to ever come to the New World.
We're talking, it's never been seen since.
No. They look out into New York Harbor, and there's a whole forest of ship masts descending on New York. And despite all of Washington's efforts to fortify New York,
there wasn't anything he could have done.
They get chased out of there, and he retreats from New York in defeat. And things are starting to look bad. And the British Army looks like it might this rebellion just started. And it's already going to be...
It might die before it's...
Yeah, it's going to be...
fully fledged.
Potentially crushed in the first autumn of its existence.
Just scary. And there's more setbacks as we go. Brandywine.
Well,
Valley Forge. Washington's early military career is kind of peppered with not so great.
Yeah. Gallant retreats.
Yeah. Gallant retreats is putting it in a really good way.
Yeah, he retreated impressively from New York, and coming up to the end of 1776, a lot of the enlistments of the men are expiring, and the whole Continental Army looks like it's going to dissolve at the end of the year.
That would be what a lost cause that would have been.
Yeah.
You want to talk about a lost cause, that would have been it.
And Washington decides, we can't go out like this. We got to do something. So the British, with their Hessian mercenaries, are sitting in winter quarters in Trenton.
Just to clarify, Hessian mercenaries, they were German guns for hire, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So Washington puts together every boat he can find on the Delaware River, and on Christmas night, I think.
Christmas Eve?
Yeah, Christmas Eve.
Yeah, I think it's Christmas Eve.
They sneak across the Delaware and punch the Hessians right in the face.
Big time. The Hessians were drunk, and most of them were asleep. When they, we can't really, within this podcast, clarify how crazy this feat was. I mean, he's crossing an icy river in shitty conditions with tired men. Mm-hmm. And not only do they have to cross the river, they have to march into Trenton.
Yeah.
unheard.
Mhm.
And surprise the Hessians who most are hungover and still sleep.
I don't know. I
And
think it might
give a
be.
surprise attack. And
I think it might be considered almost kind of a myth that the Hessians were drunk.
it could be.
Because I know that after the Americans won, they busted into the liquor supply that they found there, and they got drunk.
Well, maybe they just had a lot of booze.
Yeah. I think the Hessian commander got a report that someone was coming, and it ended up being dismissed as a false report. So they
Wow.
were kind of just complacent.
Taking it easy. That's too bad. Well, for them.
Mhm.
But not too bad for America, because
Yeah.
that was a big
Yeah, that was a real.
that was a big deal.
That was a big spark that kind of let everyone know that there's still fight left.
Yeah,
in
there
the
was that
Americans.
was kind of the catalyst to say that, okay, we might have a chance here.
Yeah, they attacked at Trenton, and then they snuck back across to the other side of the Delaware. The British were coming after them now, and then they snuck back again a few days later and fought the Battle of Princeton, which was the first time the Continental Army went face to face with the British regulars on like open ground, and they ended up winning. And there was like, I've been to the battlefield at Princeton. It's pretty cool. There's a time when like the armies were starting to clash, where like George Washington like rode out like on his white horse in front of everyone saying like, let's go guys.
Bullets whizzing by.
And the British like let loose a volley of smoke, and the people watching were like, oh, he's dead. Like Washington was right out in the middle of it. And for the first of like many times throughout his military career, he just seemed to have bullets like whiz right by him and almost miraculously not hit him.
Yeah, because that goes back to even the French and Indian War.
Right,
Like
yeah,
there was,
that's true.
Yeah, he had some like serious narrow escapes throughout his life. I mean, he almost drowned crossing a river surveying with Christopher Gist back in the day. The French and Indian War, he could have been killed. The Revolutionary War, obviously, like, and in particular, that battle where they say bullets were whizzing through his hat.
Mm-hmm.
And his coat had bullet holes in it, and
Yeah.
just remarkable that he
had a lot
was
of close
unscathed.
calls. He believed in Providence, and he had his own life as evidence to credit that he was on some kind of destined path for greatness.
Yeah, and it seems, just based on the things that he went through, it seems like he wasn't far from the truth. Like, he was kind of a, I don't know, it's like a weird kind of sort of destined figure.
Yeah. So, after that, the war kind of has several years of almost stalemate-like hunkering down, where Washington has a lot of battles they're not like outright defeats, but also not really victories.
Not definitive victories.
The only definitive victory was the one that Washington was not involved in, the Battle of Saratoga, that occurred under Horatio Gates' leadership, but I think was really more not necessarily anything Gates done, but just the stupidity of the British General Burgoyne kind of just marching out into the middle of nowhere and setting himself up to be captured. And Gates' success, while Washington is having kind of a lot of nothing going on, led to a lot of people, or not necessarily a lot of people, but a cabal of people who wanted to replace Washington as the commander-in-chief.
Good word for it, and that'll bring us back to the aforementioned Charles Lee.
Yeah.
Was involved in that, and we can talk a little bit about Charles Lee.
Yeah.
Scrawny, dirty, loved dogs.
Yeah, he had tons of dogs following him everywhere he went. He served in, I think, the legit British Army in Europe.
He did,
And
yeah.
he probably had the most real Army experience of anybody.
That's it. That's why he was so bitter. He could not stand Washington, and was looking for any excuse, basically, to
he thought he was entitled.
try and put him down.
He thought he was entitled to lead the army, but he ended up getting himself captured. He went to, on a little frolic to visit some woman, and
it was an embarrassing capture.
The British surrounded the house and captured him, and he was out of commission for like a year.
Yeah.
And the cabal that is called the Conway Cabal, after General Conway,
Conway
who
Cabal.
wrote a letter, expressing contempt for Washington, and a series of generals and officers, including, what was his name? I think it was Joseph Reed, was one of Washington's main subordinates. Who Joseph Reed was off somewhere when a letter came to headquarters for him, and Washington thought it was like an official, like, military letter. So he opened the letter and read it, and it was like, I think it was from Conway or for somebody else, like talking shit about Washington. So Washington, in one of the most like passive aggressive things ever, he just forwarded the letter on to Reed, saying, like, I thought this was an official letter, so I opened it, and then I found out that it was, a private letter, so here it is. Didn't express any, like,
any emotion whatsoever.
No.
Like, what a badass
It was just
move.
enough to know, I see what's going on here.
Yeah, because I would have, like, written back, you dirty fucking son of a bitch. I'm going to kill you on first sight. But,
And one of Horatio Gates's aides, James Wilkinson, was off one time, and he kind of got drunk and let spill that Gates and other guys were talking shit about Washington, and that kind of contributed to all these guys getting exposed as Washington haters, and eventually the Washington supporters coalesced around him and secured his place. They kind of like picked off the haters one by one and marginalized them, and there was really nobody left standing except Washington.
well, I mean, hey, when you're fated, things seem to work out a certain way, and that's just the way it worked out for Washington. And suddenly, there comes a turning point in the war. And
Ben Franklin
things are looking a little bit better.
Ben Franklin, our ambassador to France, secures an alliance with France.
Much
So
helped.
the French are coming. They're going to send their navy, which
Isn't that a weird thing to say? Like, oh, thank God the French are going to
Yeah.
help us.
Yeah. Well, we paid them back.
Yeah, we did.
2 world wars.
Yeah.
So the French came over, and that really kind of turned the tide of the war, because the French won a naval victory against the British off Chesapeake Bay, which
It was a big battle.
left Cornwallis stranded there in Yorktown. And Washington had spent years thinking that the war was going to end at New York, and trying to plan how we're going to take back New York. He had a whole like spy ring running in New York to report on what the British were doing there. But it turned out that
And that's interesting in and of itself, because of the different, like, we can't delve into everything here, but some of the spy tactics, there's documentaries on it that I would encourage people to check out. Like, I mean, we're talking like coded paper with like disappearing ink that you had to like hold it to a candle to get it to reveal itself. I mean,
yeah, I think
this is legit.
the book called Washington Spies that I've read that's really good about that. But it ended up not being New York. After a lot of campaigns in the southern states, the British found themselves kind of holed up in Yorktown, Virginia, and once the French Navy chased the British Navy away, they were kind of trapped there. And Washington and the French army marched down there real quick and surrounded the British at Yorktown and forced their surrender.
And that was it?
That was pretty much it for the war. The only other major place the British held were New York, and they were just like bottled up there. And there they sat for the next couple years while peace was being negotiated in
Right.
Britain. And Britain recognized U.S. independence.
So, what does that bring us to?
Well,
We have the official surrender on October 19th, 1781.
that's at the Battle of Yorktown. Cornwallis claimed to be sick or something and sent his second in command to surrender
Washington was miffed.
and try to hand over his sword, and Washington said, I'm not, you hand the sword to my second in command.
Yeah.
I'm not dealing with someone beneath my rank.
Yeah, fuck that noise. Who do you think I am?
So
I just beat the most powerful country in the world
yeah.
and established an independent nation, essentially.
And then George Washington did something really remarkable in the annals of history, is that he resigned his commission.
His commission, yeah.
And
that is nuts.
and was going to go back to Mount Vernon in retirement.
Be a planter farmer.
And when someone told King George III of England that George Washington was resigning and retiring, King George said, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And he did, and he was.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And
Most revolutions end in
a takeover.
in the subversion of the ideals of
That's
the
it.
revolution.
Yeah, and it
because-
corrupts the entire ethos of the thing that they started to fight for.
the successful revolutionaries who are in power they don't relinquish their power, and they end up being the thing they were fighting
Being the thing
against.
that they hated.
But Washington resigning power allowed the United States to flourish.
That is the first of just many awesome precedents that this historic man, our first chief executive, set. And when we come back from this commercial break, we are going to delve in to what led George Washington to become the first president, and then we'll delve into the presidency. We'll be back after a word from our sponsors with the Dead Presidents Podcast inaugural episode. Thank you for listening thus far. We'll be right back. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Craig and McDowell Hatters. Craig and McDowell Hatters beg leave to acquaint their friends and the public that they carry on the hatting business in all its various branches at their hat manufactory on 3rd Street near Market Street, where gentlemen's hats are dressed and cocked in the true military style, and ladies' hats made in the newest fashion and on the shortest notice. Now that's convenient. On this podcast, we do not advertise products that we don't believe in, and Craig and McDowell Hatters is no exception. These are incredible hats, James.
That's right, Steve. I wear a Craig and McDowell hat every day. I feel naked without it.
Me too. When I get all gussied up for a night on the town, my Craig and McDowell hat really brings the whole ensemble together. It is just the coup de grace to my outfit. That is Craig and McDowell Hatters, my friends, conveniently located on 3rd and Market Street. Get your new hat today. You won't regret it.
We are also proud to be sponsored by James Poupard, goldsmith, silversmith, jeweler, and engraver. James Poupard respectfully informs the public that he makes and sells all kinds of gold, silver, and jewelry work in the newest taste and at reasonable rates. He engraves all sorts of designs on copper plates. He cuts coats of arms. He makes and engraves Freemasons' medals.
Nice.
Clocks and watches are cleaned and repaired in the carefulest manner and dispatch.
That's handy.
Steve, I can't say enough about this sponsor. I gave my girlfriend some James Poupard jewelry for Valentine's Day, and I'm not going to say what happened next because there might be kids listening.
Well, that is awesome. And you could tell me after the show, give me the blow-by-blow, because I have a story about my boyfriend that I can relate as well. And wow, just James Poupard.
Indeed. You can't miss with James Poupard, goldsmith, silversmith, jeweler, and engraver.
Phenomenal stuff. Now, an important message from our sponsor, William Irwin's Stables. The famous horse Dragon
Dragon.
will cover mares this season at the stable of William Irwin at $3 and 1 bushel of oats for each mare. Good deal. The oats to be brought at the time of the covering. Dragon is well marked. 6 years old this spring, about 16 and a half hands high,
Ooh.
well made in proportion, and noted for foal getting. The season commences the 1st of April. You heard that, listeners. If you've got any mares that need impregnating, get on down to William Irwin's stables.
Oh, man. None of my mares are in heat at the moment, Steve, but if they were, I would jump at the chance to have their foals sired by a well-bred stallion like Dragon.
Well, for just $3 and a bushel of oats, you can't pass up that opportunity. To our listeners at home, if you have a horse and you'd like to buy an ad on the show to help your horse get laid, hit us up on Twitter at Dead Prez Podcast. That's Dead Prez Podcast. We are the only presidential podcast that doubles as a horse dating site, always trying to serve the community.
Nay.
And we're back. We last left George Washington in 1781.
Victorious general. Just won the Revolutionary War.
But he's not out of the woods.
No, now it's time to win the peace. And the next phase of his life, kind of the issue is the government of the United States. At the time, there's no constitution yet. We have the Articles of Confederation, which was the first constitution of the United States, which is just a really weak confederation of states. Now, once Britain is defeated, the states kind of go back to their mindset of, you know, Virginia is my country, Pennsylvania is my country, and we're just a union of states for, like, defense against foreign powers.
But that's not going to jive.
No, the Articles of Confederation is really a lot more like the United Nations
Yeah.
than it is.
Yeah, it really is.
our
It's the
current
United
Constitution.
Nations, but it's the 13 colonies.
In the Articles of Confederation, the central government doesn't have any real power. It can't levy taxes.
But there's not much of a central government to speak of.
No, it can't really do anything.
Right.
And one of the first issues was its ability to pay the debts and pay for the war.
Which were extensive.
Yeah.
And this caused a huge problem.
Yeah,
because who paid off their debts
Well,
pretty quickly? Virginia did. Virginia had paid off a lot of their debts
it paid off.
because they were wealthy, and other
And they didn't have.
colonies didn't have the kind of
Yeah, they didn't have. I mean,
funding.
Virginia didn't have as much war debt because not as much of the war was fought in Virginia as in the North.
And they had some money to begin with.
Yeah.
So like they were looking well and good. I'm sure they were fine with it, but like
Well, the Revolutionary War soldiers were not because
yeah,
they were unpaid.
yeah, exactly.
The war ends and they owe a lot of pay to all the men and officers, and they don't have any money, and the men are not happy about it. And
Who would be?
Some members of the government and the Continental Congress, including Alexander Hamilton at the time, and the finance minister Robert Morris, they want to amend the articles to enable the central government to tax so they can pay its debts. But the rest of the government's not going for that. I think under the articles, in order to enact anything substantial, they needed 9 out of the 13 states to agree, and that was really hard to get.
So you had to have a solid majority.
Yeah, so one of the ways that Hamilton and Morris and them were trying to conspire to get taxing powers passed was to kind of drum up agitation in the army. Because the last 2 years between the victorious Battle of Yorktown and the peace treaty, the army's kind of just sitting around.
Right.
And it's, increasingly not happy about not being paid.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been difficult to, motivate these guys to say, hey, you're kind of getting shafted here.
Mm-hmm. And that's what they did when the army was encamped at Newberg, New York. There occurred what is known as the Newberg Conspiracy, where, a lot of officers, kind of led by Horatio Gates, were agitating to try to get themselves paid and were kind of threatening to mutiny against the government if they didn't get paid. And there was
trying some strong-arm tactics.
They kind of called a meeting and sent out some circular letters among the officers encouraging discontent. And Washington ended up squashing all this when he showed up at the meeting and spoke out against it. And the defining moment was he gave his speech about how we need to sacrifice on behalf of the cause we fought for. And if we turn against our government, then everything we fought for is going to be lost. And then he pulled out a letter from somebody else that he was going to read. And he went to put on his glasses and he said, forgive me, for I have grown not only gray but almost blind in the service of my country.
Damn.
And that moment caused all the officers to burst into tears and lament their self-interestedness in the face of Washington's sacrifice.
I don't think that would happen today.
He squashed the potential mutiny with that moment.
Powerful. Imposing. It's just, I think, like I said, I don't think that could happen today. I don't know that that could happen with any other figure.
Yeah.
Just Washington as a person. Soft-spoken and imposing, and when he did speak, it spoke volumes.
Yeah, there's not a lot of major figures who wield that kind of power, but then use it in the cause of restraint and sacrifice.
No, virtually none.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's...
But the problems with the Continental, or the Confederation Congress didn't end there, because it continued for the next half-decade without really any power to do anything. A lot of the states are suffering economically, and people are in debt, and they are agitating for debt forgiveness, and rebellions break out in a couple states, and more of the leaders are seeing that this government we have isn't working, and so they call the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, because something has to be done. We've broken away from our mother country, and now we're just this void, this thing, these 13 bits and bobs that need to try and work together, and that's going to bring us up to the Constitutional Convention in the year 1787.
Yeah. So Washington had retired to his farm, and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are behind the calling of the convention, and they kind of lure Washington out of retirement, telling him, we need your prestige behind this effort to carry a new constitution.
Do you think that they thought that maybe different people wouldn't take it as seriously unless Washington was involved? They thought that it was integral, we have to have Washington here. That's the only way it's going to work.
Yeah, it was definitely integral, and it ended up being that they were able to make the presidency a substantial and powerful office.
He was just somebody that everybody could agree on. There was no other person.
Yeah. Everyone knew that Washington would be the first president, and so because they trusted him, they trusted making the presidency a powerful office, when they were otherwise very suspicious of executive power and didn't trust a powerful executive. They trusted Washington, so that he created the presidency basically because people trusted him.
Right, and obviously nobody knew what this executive office would be. People knew the powers of the king. They didn't know what we were going to try necessarily. It was really, the whole thing was a shot in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, and it was really the trust that people had in Washington that allowed the experiment to even happen.
And that really, that just says, like, so much about his character that I don't know that you could really say that about many other figures in history, if any.
No. He was unanimously chosen as president, and I read somewhere that they said that future presidents, the president was respected because of the office he held, but with Washington, the office of the presidency was respected because of the man who held it, and it was really the force of his.
It was him.
It was him who created the presidency by his own,
his own character.
Yeah.
Just his own being, like, really formed the idea of what a president should be. And that's what we're about to dive headfirst into.
We're now into the presidency.
We are going to talk 1789. Washington is unanimously chosen. Everybody's for it. He is chosen. So, how do we do this? We're brand new. Is there pomp? Is there ceremony? What's his title gonna be?
Yeah.
Is there a coronation? What are we gonna do here? Mm-hmm. All these questions face us here in 1789, and how does Washington respond to calls for kind of like a regal sort of introduction that some folks kind of put forward should be the thing?
Well, he's against it. The Senate, I think, debated what to call the president and came up with various ostentatious, very lengthy titles.
And we should remark here that let's just remark on the system of voting and how the vice president was chosen before we proceed, because he's going to come into play in the future, plus this has some bearing on his input.
Yeah, before the 12th Amendment, which was passed after the 1800 election, the presidency and vice presidency were not voted on separately. That each elector to the Electoral College would cast 2 votes, not distinguishing who you want as president and vice president, and just whoever gets the most votes is president, and whoever gets second most is vice president.
Obviously, this would lead to problems, so nobody was picking their own running mates.
Yeah.
These were essentially what it would become is opponents having to work together in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it caused problems in all the first 3 elections that had happened in.
Yeah.
So John Adams ended up being the vice president.
Right. John Adams, vice president, and this is why I brought him up, is he came into play in regards to how the presidency was to be viewed by the people. Should it be a very imposing and regal thing? Yeah. Adams seemed to lean towards, yeah.
Yeah, he thought people wouldn't respect the office if it didn't have a lot of
flowery language
on it.
Yeah. And Washington was not having that.
He nixed that
immediately.
He said, just call me Mr. President. That's enough.
So that there is the first of, I mean, we're going to delve into so many precedents here because everything was uncharted territory, but that right there is telltale in terms of Washington's character.
Hmm.
So I mean that's respectful.
Yeah, he's
You know.
setting the tone for the whole, experiment in Republican Democratic government.
Yeah, he had like restrain that a lot of people put into that position would not have. They would get drunk with power or what have you.
Yeah, the Constitution is, it's pretty short. It's just some kind of vague general words on the page, and the first government and president have to breathe life into it, and everything they do sets a precedent for the future.
There's a bunch of stuff kind of set up, and they're going to build onto it, but none of it means a thing if they can't act on it. Mm-hmm. So let's dive headfirst into Washington's first term as president.
Yeah, one of the first orders of business was the creation of the executive departments of State, War, and Treasury.
And that sounds really boring today, but my God.
I mean, that's really important and fundamental.
You couldn't have the country without it. It's just like, he did this and this and this. Well,
the cabinet's not in the Constitution.
He had to come up with it. He relied on a team of, people, and like his cabinet. My God,
all-star
best
team.
in history. You're talking the dream team.
Yep.
Of cabinet, and I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit. Diving into that, but maybe we start.
That's
talking about the
time.
cabinet just right off the bat before we dive into the first administration. Washington's cabinet was the dream team.
A who's who.
It was, the miracle on ice. Like we're talking, just the ultimate.
Yeah.
Of teams.
Secretary of State.
T.J. himself, Thomas Jefferson.
Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton.
The Sawbuck figure.
Inventor of rap music.
Yeah.
I heard.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
It's on Broadway.
And my big man, the big dog, the OG Secretary of War himself, Mr. Henry Knox.
He's the man. Edmund Randolph was Attorney General. Attorney General was not actually a cabinet position at the time. Department of Justice was not a thing. The Attorney General was just the president's lawyer. But it became more important later. Washington also appointed the whole Supreme Court.
Right.
So the first entire Supreme Court was all him. And
no other president will ever get to do that.
No.
Well,
hopefully not.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully not. Okay. Enough about that. But yeah, huge. And you might say to yourself, hey, you said Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, Attorney General. Where's everybody else? There wasn't anybody else.
That's it.
That was it.
Yeah.
You had 5 people. And different people were replaced. Edmund Randolph replaced Jefferson as Secretary of State. And in turn, William Bradford took over Randolph's position as Attorney General. So there's some shifting. But, the initial run was a brilliant selection that you really couldn't better that.
Yeah, they really set the tone, especially Hamilton, who kind of really dove in and took a lot onto himself, did a lot of big things. He really saw himself as like a prime minister,
right,
who had his fingers in foreign policy and all kinds of stuff that wasn't necessarily just the Treasury Department.
Yeah.
But Hamilton, went right to work devising, a national financial system where the federal government assumed the state's debts.
And what kind of thought process, what kind of intelligence would that have entailed? I mean, you're talking about somebody that built the financial system on which this country is run, essentially.
Yeah, well, Hamilton wanted to make the federal government established like a substantial thing, and he realized the best way to do that was to have it be in debt, so that all the richest people in the country who are owed money are depending on the federal government to pay it. Then they're going to make sure that the federal government has the power to tax
Yeah.
and the power to pay its debts. So by being in debt, he yoked the most powerful interests in the country to the federal government and secured the power to levy taxes and establish a bank. And that really set the national economy on good standing. I think by the end of Hamilton's
Which
term,
was totally necessary. I mean, because like you said before, we were not in great financial straits.
Yeah, we had huge debt and no means to pay it. And by the time Hamilton was done, I think the United States had the best credit rating in the whole world.
Which is beyond impressive,
Yeah.
truly. I mean, just wild. But Hamilton, of course, different story. Let's talk precedents, which we have been, but let's hear what Washington has to say about precedents. Quote, "Many things which appear of little importance in themselves, and at the beginning, may have great and durable consequences from their having been established at the commencement of a new general government." So, he is pretty pragmatic about doing all this, and he has a great team. So, he relies on people's advice, much like he did in the war. He would consult. He was the president, the presider. So he was absolutely looking for outside opinions. He was not saying, this is what it is, this is what it is, this is what it is. He was asking opinions and formulating his own based on advice from his team, his council.
Yeah, he put the best people in place and
That's
let
it.
them do their thing.
Let them do their thing. And
then, once they got it, and then he would, whatever policy they decided on that he liked, he would back it up with his prestige and how much everyone loved and trusted him. Once he put his weight behind something, it gets done. Lots of people didn't like Hamilton and were suspicious of the kind of things he was trying to pass, but once Washington stood behind them, they got done.
Right. Another thing that I think says a lot about Washington's character, and this is just jumping ahead a little bit, but we're talking about precedents, and so I want to bring up the fact that after 2 terms, Washington decided to step down, because he could have done it for life.
Yeah.
I mean, he really could have changed the game. He could have done whatever the hell he wanted, essentially.
Yep. Yeah, the initial Constitution had no term limits on the president. They could serve for life. And, Washington didn't want to do that. He probably didn't really want to be president at all. But there was no one else. He wanted to retire after his first term. But by the end of his first term, the Hamilton and Jefferson kind of factions were really emerging, and were at each other's.
We had some shit going on, and it was detrimental enough to the new nation that he was like, shit.
Yeah, they were at each other's throats.
I gotta be here.
And it speaks to who Washington was, that at that time, like, both Hamilton and Jefferson both begged Washington not to retire.
Right.
Everyone knew he was the only thing.
He was the only thing
together.
he was the needle and thread.
Yeah. But by the end of his second term, he was, I'm done with this. And he didn't even live another 4 years, so
No.
he was getting up there.
Yeah.
And,
Tired.
And he wanted to set the precedent of giving up power, just like he did at the end of the Revolutionary War.
And that was
his
incredibly
generalship.
important because, like, without doing that, I mean, the history would be completely different.
If Jefferson had wanted a third term, he could have got reelected, but he retired after 2 and cited George Washington as the precedent for doing so. And that became a thing that all presidents informally followed until FDR. And after he did it and violated that precedent, the Constitution was amended to make a 2-term limit.
Right.
So
But,
Washington...
it could have been a different story. Like, if Washington, they weren't going to do a familial monarchical thing. They want Adams as vice president for 2 terms. Say he gets in there and I'm like, I'm just going to stick around. Well, I don't know. Anyway, I want to talk one more precedent before we move on into some different administrative events. But John Jay, whom you are familiar with, resigned as Chief Justice during Washington's term. And Washington did something pretty
unexpected.
Now, what was that?
Well,
and what did it mean?
He just chose a totally new person to be Chief Justice, which is like a president's way of kind of asserting dominance over the court in a way of, I'm not just going to put whoever happens to already be on the court in charge. I'm going to put my own person in charge. And that became, a precedent that was used all the way up till now when George W. Bush nominated the brand new John Roberts to be chief instead of anyone else who was on the court.
Right.
And in doing so, he put a very young chief on who's going to be there for a very long time.
Quite a long time.
We're still sitting here now 15 years after that happened, and Roberts is probably going to be there a long time. And that was all a George Washington precedent.
Yeah. That's really something.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. And there's so many more precedents that we could talk about just down to the nitty-gritty, but I want to move on to something that means something to me personally. Indian affairs. This is where I'm not a big Washington fan.
Yeah.
On Indian affairs. It's people defending their land and he's dispatching federal troops to quell them. It's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and then you have bullshit treaties and
Yeah, I mean,
it's not pleasant. It's just not pleasant to talk about. It's something that happened. It sucked. And it I mean, you want to say the context of the times, but it's hard for me to not to say well, I mean, it's fucked up. We weren't here first, and now here we are in quote unquote full possession of this certain amount of land that already has people living there, and now we're telling them we're going to kill you if you don't resist.
Yeah, well, they kind of played like a double game against the Indians, where Washington and the policy was, we want peace and we want to negotiate with the Indians, and they would send people out to negotiate. But at the same time, they're raising an army to send out there to back up the negotiations.
Right.
And after the Revolution, before the Revolution, Britain was trying to stop people from moving out into Indian territory because they didn't want to defend the frontier. And that was one of the major causes of the Revolution. But afterwards, the U.S. government kind of finds itself in the same position where it kind of doesn't want people going out there because they're just creating friction with the Indians.
Yeah.
But people go out there of their own accord. The government can't stop them. And once they go out there and start clashing with the Indians, they basically have no choice but to back their own people and fight the Indians.
I mean, there's a certain amount of landlust involved, but, when things started getting to the point where the people who live on the land are defending their land from these assholes who are just going out there trying to claim like big sections of territory for themselves, big plots of acreage for themselves. They end up getting killed.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's a crime against the United States on account of some fucking asshole. And so it's the beginning of, and it's not the beginning. It has been going on since the first white man came over, but it's just a continual escalation of cultural genocide.
Yeah.
And a whole new chapter of it, and it's a dark chapter.
Yeah.
And it's going to get worse as we go on through the
Yeah.
podcast, unfortunately.
Well, the Indians in kind of the Ohio Valley, Northwest Territory, which is where the, hot point of war during Washington's presidency was, they fought with the British in the Revolutionary War against the colonists.
Right.
And then the British sold them out in the peace negotiations, and just the British gave all of that land to the United States, despite the fact that their Indian allies lived on it.
Well, yeah, so it's basically just like a typical, like, the white man looks down on them because they're savages.
Yeah.
The
United States felt we got all this land because Britain gave it to us, but it wasn't necessarily theirs to give.
Exactly. So I don't know. The white man is guilty. We'll leave it at that, and we're going to move to 1793 with the Proclamation of Neutrality. Now, this is pretty important, and it was a big deal.
This really sets the tone of American foreign policy for the next 100 years, kind of.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
In 1789, the French Revolution breaks out, and a few years later, France is going to war against practically everybody in Europe, particularly Britain, and the United States is being caught in the middle. We want to have economic and trading relationships with both countries, but neither one of them wants us trading with their enemy.
Right.
Both of them want, and particularly France, who we had a treaty of defensive alliance with from the Revolution. A lot of Americans like France because they helped us and think maybe we should help France against the hated British.
And the top people in Washington's cabinet are divided on this.
Yeah,
are they not?
Yeah, because Jefferson is a big Francophile, but Hamilton knows that Britain is our most important economic relationship. Right. And that even though they were our enemy, that they're maybe in the long term more of a natural ally. But that ultimately...
Do you think it's because he thought, well, maybe did we luck out? Like, are they like still the most powerful thing? Are they to be the most feared? Is it? Does it come down to maybe we'd have a better chance against the French than the British?
Yeah,
so
because the British have the most dominant naval power.
Right, that's what I mean.
They have the power to reach out to America, and
so we're talking beyond import-export. Was it maybe just like a conscious decision of it makes more logical sense to side with them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
to fight them would be a serious error.
Yep, because we're a brand new country who.
We lucked out.
We're barely establishing the power to tax and have a central government. They're barely getting enough of an army to go beat the Indians. Yeah. They don't have an army to fight anybody, really. So Washington, having spent many years head of an army that didn't have enough men or means to fight the war.
Yeah, and that's what when I say we lucked out, do you agree to a certain extent that we did kind of luck out in terms of victory in the Revolutionary War? It was just circumstance.
Sure. Yeah, lots of things had to go our way for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it was really I want to quote Dirty Work and say, if I had to bet on it, I would bet everything I own on death. it just like it seems such a shot in the dark to like so little chance and just different things, overseas conflict that they were having. There was a lot of stuff that played into it. So maybe there was a little bit of luck there.
Yeah, and I think Washington at the center of it knew how lucky we were and knew how weak our army really always had been despite winning, and knew that we couldn't fight another war. And so he was determined on
to keep
neutrality.
it in the center. And yeah, it caused problems, but we had a nation unprepared for war, and he kept us out of it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and I think hindsight really proved him correct. And also Hamilton and the Federalists, I think, ended up reading the French Revolution more accurately than the Jeffersonians did, because within a year or so of this happening, the French Revolution is descending into chaos,
right,
where they're having the reign of terror and executing everybody who doesn't agree with them.
Yep.
And the Marquis de Lafayette, who was the great, volunteer in the American army and Washington's great friend, the French Revolution turned against him, and he was exiled and imprisoned. And
it didn't quite work out the same way. I mean, that's where I hate to use the term luck so much, but there's just, it's fate, maybe is a better word to use. I don't know. Destiny? I don't know. Yeah,
the Jeffersonians like to see, we had our revolution for democracy, and now France is having theirs. There are
so they thought
there are ideological brothers,
right?
But then France went off on a very bloody tangent.
Yes, they
where
did.
They didn't have a George Washington type restraint at the top.
Yeah,
of the
there wasn't a
revolution.
figure that had the imposing respect. But I think initially with the Proclamation of Neutrality, they were pissed off that it looked like we went back on our ally in the war. So we reneged on, it was like, oh, well, France helped us to win the war. Like, we have to side with France. And Washington's like, no, we don't have to.
The other side of that is we signed a treaty with the King of France, and these people just cut his head off.
Well,
this is a different France.
Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, we're talking. Okay, that agreement becomes null and void when his head's in a wicker basket.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
But ultimately, we stayed out of European wars for another almost 20 years, till the War of 1812, when we were not quite ready, but enough ready to survive it and come out better on the other side.
But before then, we almost had a little bit of a civil war at home, didn't we, Jim?
Yeah.
And we're talking 1794, and this is another thing. We mentioned earlier that we are from the Pittsburgh area. A lot of history here. And
hotbed of the Whiskey Rebellion.
That is it. We are about to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. What is the Whiskey Rebellion? Who would rebel against whiskey?
Well, they're rebelling in favor of whiskey.
Oh, well, that makes a little bit more sense. Let's enlighten ourselves as to the Whiskey Rebellion and a presidential show of force that would never be seen again.
Nope. The new Hamilton financial system included taxes. One of those taxes...
Taxes? We just had a war against those.
Well, you got to pay for that war.
yeah, you got to pay for that fucking war.
Yeah, one of the things they taxed was whiskey, and whiskey was a big industry out in the western frontier, which at the time was Pittsburgh. And Hamilton's tax was not appreciated by a lot of people out here. It was considered very unfair. One of the ways that it was unfair was that it taxed whiskey by the capacity of the still. So if you didn't operate your still at full capacity, you still had to pay tax as if you were operating it at full capacity. And that really prejudiced a lot of small producers.
Yeah.
And it actually favored the Walmartization of whiskey production.
The small businesses.
Yeah. So a lot of the small people were pissed, and they were going after the federal tax collectors. Like, we're not paying this tax. The one tax collector was tarred and feathered. And I think it was General Neville, who was the head of the tax collection effort, I believe. He also happened to be one of the Walmarts of the new whiskey production industry.
Yeah.
The insurgents surrounded his house, and they ended up shooting a couple of guys. And so the federal government is pissed now, and they've been prosecuting people for not paying tax. And another one of the ways that really upped the ante, and is a way that people almost accuse Hamilton of fomenting the rebellion on purpose, is that the way they prosecuted people or sued them for tax is that they summoned them to court in Philadelphia, which from Pittsburgh was a huge burden and pain in the ass.
Right.
So that was also a huge point in contention. So a lot of people around the Pittsburgh area and other areas nearby were basically holding themselves in rebellion against the tax. Talking about maybe even like seceding, becoming an independent nation called Westsylvania.
Boom, boom, boom. Well, we saw how that worked out.
And
now, what was Washington's response to this tomfoolery?
He wasn't going to stand for it. And this is almost what Hamilton seemingly wanted to happen, because he wanted to prove that the federal government has authority
and power.
So he wants a chance to demonstrate that authority. So
and now he's got it.
They call up the militias and put together about 15,000 troops to march on Pittsburgh. And George Washington, who's president of the United States, marches at the head of the army as the commanding general.
And personally inspects the troops in the field.
Yep. He goes about as far as Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And by this time, news is coming back from Pittsburgh where all the rebels are they're backpedaling on their rebellion now that they see that the federal government is serious. And it's clear now that there's not going to be any real resistance to this army.
Yeah.
So Washington goes home.
Such a show of force was enough to deter
and Hamilton
a second revolution.
Yeah.
In the wake of the first.
Hamilton was Treasury Secretary, but he also finagled his way into being acting War Secretary at this time, because Henry Knox had some personal financial troubles in Massachusetts. So Hamilton was like, "Yeah, go back to Massachusetts. I'll handle the War Secretary duties for this little war I'm fomenting." And
what a ham!
He rides with the army to Pittsburgh, and they start arresting people, and they end up charging a handful of people with treason and convicting them. And Washington issues the first pardons, letting them off the hook, but demonstrating that the federal government is not
fucking around.
Fucked with.
Yeah.
When we say you're taxed, you effing pay it.
Yeah, that's it. So huge. And man, how it comes to mind, how would other presidents deal with that? But that's another topic for another day. What we're going to move on to now is why don't we talk a little bit about Jay's Treaty?
Yeah.
That was in 1795, and this is another thing that brought about some Jeffersonian criticism.
Yeah, the Jay Treaty is really where Washington's kind of status is almost being beyond criticism really starts to take a hit.
Right.
The last couple years of his presidency, there's a segment of people who start to get really nasty against him, and it has a lot to do with the Jay Treaty.
Yeah.
Because at the end, the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, Britain agreed to evacuate all of its forts and posts in the Northwest, kind of the Detroit, including Detroit and that kind of area, but they ended up not doing it. So they're still up there, and there's just a lot of tension between Britain and the U.S. about the U.S. wanting to trade with France and Britain not wanting them to do so. U.S. wants to trade with Britain, and it wants to boss the U.S. around in order to be able to do that. And it's looking like we're going to be potentially on the verge of war with Britain.
Well, we don't want to be anybody's bitch.
No. Washington sends John Jay to Britain to negotiate a treaty. And he negotiates a deal that will, the British agree to get out of the forts in the Northwest. They're going to let us have some trade in the Caribbean and other places, but we're not allowed to trade with France if Britain doesn't like it. And Britain is going to continue the practice of impressment, which is the involuntary drafting of people into the British Navy.
And that continued to be a problem for a while.
Yeah, that was one of, if not the major cause of the War of 1812.
Right.
Still. But Britain believed that, once a British subject, always a British subject. So British sailors who wanted to become American citizens,
forget about it.
Britain still said, you're still obligated to serve in the Royal Navy, so they would...
For the king.
They would abduct a lot of, arguably American citizens to serve in the British Navy.
For the peace of the kingdom.
And the Jay Treaty let that keep happening. And it allowed Britain to curtail our trade with France, but that was the price of not going to war. And Washington didn't like this treaty, but he knew it was like the best we could do outside of war.
And he really took some shit for it. I actually want to read a couple of quotes that are in reference to this in particular. But it may have some stuff to do with another topic we'll talk about here. But at least these first two in particular are directly in response to Jay's Treaty of 1796. This is a quote from the Philadelphia Aurora. If ever a nation was debauched by a man, the American nation has been debauched by Washington. If ever a nation was deceived by a man, the American nation has been deceived by Washington. Let his conduct, then, be an example to future ages. Let it serve to be a warning that no man may be an idol. And right around the same time, Thomas Jefferson responded to Washington's support of the treaty by saying thus, quote, "An Anglican monarchical and aristocratical party has sprung up, whose avowed object is to draw over us the substance, as they have already done the forms of the British government. It would give you a fever were I to name to you the apostates who have gone over to these heresies, men who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the council, but who have had their heads shorn by the harlot England." And that's pretty deep. I'm going to save the last quote because I don't know if it's directly in response to that. Perhaps it is.
I think that's the Thomas Paine quote is.
That's what I'm referring to.
I think that's a very personal thing with Thomas Paine.
Yeah, it's a very personal thing.
That Jefferson letter is really interesting. He wrote that in a letter to a friend of his in Europe, not intending that it ever become public.
Yeah.
And that letter ended up finding its way published in a newspaper.
Intercepted.
And it came back to, bite Jefferson bad, where he makes this dig at Washington, and that really severed their relationship.
Yeah.
Where they were never friends after that. And I heard an interesting thing, that in the wake of this, there was allegedly a series of nasty letters exchanged between Washington and Jefferson. And then when Washington died, his personal secretary, Tobias Lear, was in charge of his papers. And this is right as Jefferson was getting elected president. Conveniently, these letters, alleged letters from Washington talking shit about Jefferson, disappear.
Oh,
And Tobias Lear finds himself appointed to some lucrative ambassadorships in the Jefferson administration.
oh,
And-
handy dandy.
And it's, speculated that Tobias Lear buried these letters, and that if some, in the contentious election of 1800, if some letters from George Washington had been published calling Thomas Jefferson a piece of shit, that might have doomed his candidacy.
Wow. That is a something. So, we brought up the Thomas Paine quote. I think we might as well just read it now.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about what it might have been in reference to. So, this is a quote from Thomas Paine, who wrote...
Common Sense.
That's right. And this is from an open letter to Washington written in 1796, the same year as the Jay's Treaty. You commenced your presidential career by encouraging and swallowing the grossest adulation, and you traveled America from one end to the other to put yourself in the way of receiving it. You have as many addresses in your chest as James II. The character which Mr. Washington has attempted to act in this world is a sort of non-describable chameleon-colored thing called prudence. It is in many cases a substitute for principle, and is so nearly allied to hypocrisy that it easily slides into it. And as to you, sir, treacherous to private friendship, for so you have been to me, and that in the day of danger, and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles, or whether you ever had any.
Damn.
Sick burn!
Thomas Paine throwing some shade.
Throwing some serious shade. Now, what do you surmise that could have been about, Jim?
Well, Thomas Paine got famous for writing Common Sense at the beginning of the Revolution,
Right.
which really coalesced people around the cause of independence.
Yeah.
And
It was an important document.
Yeah.
Like, we can't understate Thomas Paine. Like,
it was huge.
yeah.
But then
I mean, Thomas Paine's an important dude.
He kind of went, sideways in later years. He went to Europe, and he was in France during the French Revolution. He ended up becoming like a member of the French Revolutionary Legislature. So
Yeah.
he's like American, but he's in the French Revolution. And in the tumult of that, he ends up on the wrong side and finds himself in jail. And
So do you think he felt a sense of self-importance? Like,
Yeah.
he had been, like, I started this revolution and I could win this one.
Yeah, he was really full of himself, I think.
Yeah.
And when
That seems to be...
When he got imprisoned, he felt like the American government wasn't doing enough to get him released, even though we didn't send him there and had nothing to do with what he was doing there. And James Monroe, who was the minister to France at the time, did get him out eventually, but not fast enough for Thomas Paine's liking. And so he got real nasty about it.
Well,
And those, what we just read between Paine and Jefferson, those are really kind of the nastiest quotes against Washington.
well, there's not too many others.
Yeah, and I
To be
think,
honest.
I think those ones kind of say more about Paine and Jefferson than they do about Washington.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not too much Washington bashing going on outside of, we talked about Charles Lee a little bit earlier, people like that. Back during the war at the beginning, people dissed him, but, like, as a president, like, outside of that,
Yeah, he was pretty universally beloved by the people, so, opposing him was at your peril.
and that's
Like,
it. And, like,
Jeffer-
obviously that led to him being unanimously reelected. We did kind of, like, just skip over the fact that
Yeah, I think we talked about most of the major issues of his presidency. The Bill of Rights was enacted during his presidency. The president doesn't really have much of a direct role in that. That was kind of James Madison's baby that he pushed through.
Yeah.
Another thing that happened was Washington negotiated a treaty with Spain.
Yeah,
Spain,
this is Pinckney's Treaty, 1795, and that's important. We're talking the 31st parallel as the established boundary between the United States and Spanish Florida. So that'll be important a little bit later on, but like at this point, it is really important for commerce.
Yeah, at this time, Spain controlled the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, and all the western states depended on that river to deliver their goods. So
Yeah.
they were really unhappy about that.
This helped us to get access to the Mississippi River and, most importantly, the Port of New Orleans, which was... Yeah, well, I don't know if that's more important than the Mississippi River, but my God, I mean...
That's the port that
they coincide. So the Port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River, I mean, for us to be able to utilize that...
That was big because in the years before that, Kentucky, there was a secession movement in Kentucky where Kentucky could have become independent and become an ally with Spain and gotten navigation of the Mississippi that way because the federal government wasn't delivering and they were looking elsewhere.
So we're talking about serious problems like that go unnoticed a lot of times. Like, I'm going to tell you straight up, and you'd probably agree with me. We've learned more outside of school than in.
Yeah,
I don't think I ever
American
realized
history,
how many different times that there was like the potential for a civil war.
Yeah, I think people...
Like, just during Washington's administration. Like, there was a lot that...
Nowadays, nowadays people take for granted that the United States is a united country, but back at the time, the Union was very tenuous, and for the first whole generation, everyone was ready for the Union to break apart at the drop of a hat almost. And there were several very serious potential secession movements in the early... first few presidents.
Just wild. And I just want to... We'll just close up this segment with a couple other additional factoids about Washington's administration. And we had the first federal census in 1790. Patent and copyright protection was introduced. The capital was removed to Philadelphia in 1790, and then to Washington 10 years later, which...
Well, yeah, in 1790 it was determined that the permanent capital would be on this totally unsettled spot by the Potomac that became D.C.
Right.
And in the 10-year meantime, it'd be in Philadelphia.
And that's a interesting story in and of itself, really, like the selection of the land and how that came about. I don't know if do we want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, we can. It was, I mean, it's like, half an hour drive nowadays from where George Washington lived. So
yeah.
He was all about that being
exactly
the place. And
But it was a swamp.
Yeah, basically.
Essentially, like it was,
Yeah,
it wasn't prime real estate. Let's put it that way.
I mean, it kind of was, or at least they thought it was, because Washington and a lot of other people had high hopes on the Potomac being like the main artery of American commerce at the time when the Mississippi River was not open to us.
Right.
The whole Ohio-Mississippi artery was an issue, and people like Washington thought rather than that, we can create a series of canals that will make the Potomac the shit. But that ended up being where they put the capital, and that was part of the deal that got Hamilton's debt assumption plan passed, where Virginia and them were not thrilled about it, but they let it go through in exchange for the capital being put in the South rather than in the North.
Very, very interesting stuff. we also had, and this is going to come up again and again in these initial episodes, well, at least the first 11. And that is the establishment of the Bank of the United States. And then, of course, you had the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia established. But the Bank of the United States...
That was big. I mean, that was what Hamilton believed was a necessary part of the whole financial mechanism. The Jeffersonians thought, I mean, they didn't like the idea and tried to claim that it was not a constitutional power for the government to establish a bank. Hamilton argued that it was an implied power, that it's implied within the power to coin money and borrow and spend and tax, that you can use the bank as the means to those ends. And Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson both submitted their arguments to George Washington, and he ultimately went with Hamilton. And Hamilton's argument there became a major constitutional precedent that the Supreme Court later cited when they made basically the doctrine of implied powers law.
Well, there we have that, and that we'll be talking a lot more about the Bank of the United States in future episodes, believe me. Last but not least, just on little tidbits here, we had the Naturalization Law in 1795, which lengthened residency requirement from 2 to 5 years. What we're going to do now is take a little break and bring to you a word from our beloved sponsors.
We'll look at George Washington in the big picture, and we'll talk about our own trip to Mount Vernon.
That's right. It's going to be eye-opening.
After these words from our sponsors.
And now a word from our sponsors.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Thomas Miller, who asked us to publish this important notice. Whereas my wife Rosanna hath left my bed and board without cause, hath in my absence wantonly squandered away the hard earnings of my industry, and hath behaved and continues to behave in a manner disgraceful to her sex and our matrimonial contract, I do hereby announce to the public that I will not pay any debts of her contracting from this date forward. There you have it, listeners. Don't let Rosanna Miller run up any debts expecting her husband to pay them.
I don't blame him, James, at all. Considering this just disgraceful conduct. Just sickening, loathsome conduct that she's apparently engaged in since leaving his bed and board.
This isn't exactly a family-friendly podcast, but we're not going to go into graphic detail about the disgraceful things Rosanna Miller is accused of.
We couldn't.
Suffice to say, she's said to have breached her matrimonial contract in several different positions.
Ugh, loathsome.
So, don't lend money to Rosanna Miller. A message from our sponsor, Thomas Miller.
Thank you, Thomas. And my God, be on the lookout for that shrew of a woman. My goodness. Horrible. We are also proud to be sponsored by Mrs. Pine's boarding school for young ladies, where young ladies are instructed in every useful and ornamental accomplishment, such as reading, writing, grammar, arithmetic, all kinds of needlework, drawing, French, geography, music, and dancing under the care and tuition of Mrs. Pine. So, listeners, if you want your daughter to have a good marriage and not end up like the now infamous Rosanna Miller, there's no better choice than Mrs. Pine's boarding school for young ladies.
That's right, Steve. I'd like to land myself a Mrs. Pine's graduate someday. Those girls are the gold standard.
So true, James. They are the cream of the crop. My dating profile says, quote, must know all kinds of needlework. You might not believe this, but I've gone on dates with girls who don't know any needlework. Can you believe that?
No.
Well, don't let that be your daughter. Enroll her today at Mrs. Pine's boarding school for young ladies. Neither of you will regret it, and nor will anyone that she comes in contact with. That could lead to a good marriage with someone with property.
Exactly. Finally, we have an important message from our sponsor, Colonel John Irwin. Hemp Wanted by Colonel John Irwin, 2nd Street near Redoubt Alley. A generous price will be paid for good, clean hemp. So listeners, if you've got hemp, our sponsor, Colonel John Irwin, is ready to throw down straight cash.
You know what, James? I've got some cash to throw down, and I could use some hemp myself. There's just so many uses. Paper, rope.
Among other things.
Among other things. Just unbelievable.
You heard the man. If you're selling good, clean hemp, hit us up on Twitter at Dead Prez Podcast.
That's Dead Prez, P-R-E-Z, Podcast.
Your source for selling your hemp.
And now back to the show.
We are back, and we are getting ready to wrap up this episode. One of the reasons Steve and I wanted to do this podcast, or one of the indicators, I guess, of our presidential passion has been all the trips we've taken to a bunch of different presidential houses. I think we've been on probably almost 10 different trips to probably almost 15 different presidents' houses. And one of the ones we went on recently was we took a trip to Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate.
As well as his distillery.
Yep. One of the cool things about Washington's plantation is it has a still active distillery on it. You can go and see how whiskey was made at the time. Washington established that distillery, I think, late in his life, but it quickly became one of the most profitable aspects of his business.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that at one point he was the single largest independent distributor in the country.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, yeah, Steve, you got some of the whiskey from there.
Yeah.
How was that?
Yeah, I got the really expensive kind, too, that was just, oh man.
High quality?
It went down too fast for the price, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
It was really good, it was really smooth, it had a bite, and it was one of those things where it kind of, maybe it was just the name of it and where we got it and stuff like that. Maybe I've had things that I've enjoyed more in terms of taste, but it was just the historical context of, like, this is what was produced at Washington's distillery, so, yeah, it went down pretty quick, and I loved it.
Nice. That's what George Washington's all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, of all the presidents' houses we went to, like, Mount Vernon is one of the, like, big ones. They got a real nice setup there. Lots of stuff to look at. It's right on the Potomac. Great view. Really nice house. You can see the bed that he died in, and all that stuff. One of the interesting aspects.
Yeah, I was going to say there was one kind of curious aspect, and it wasn't on the main tour. It's like they go out of the way not to, like, point it out.
Yeah, it's one of the little outbuildings.
Yeah, you can't miss it.
Yeah,
just touch on that for a minute.
There's an outhouse. You know, they didn't have indoor plumbing at the time.
Of course not.
You had to go to the outhouse. But what's interesting about this outhouse is it was a two-seater.
Yeah.
There are 2 holes for people to sit down in the outhouse, and we couldn't help but picture George and Martha just...
Or maybe it's like if he had guests. There's a house full and it's like 2 people have to go at the same time and they walk out there and just awkwardly sit next to each other and poop.
George and Martha taking a tandem dump.
Yeah.
That
Or
could have happened.
Who could have visited Mount Vernon? Ben Franklin comes over and they're having dinner and Martha's like, "Oh, please excuse me." And she walks out and Ben Franklin's like, "As a matter of fact, I think I feel a little something coming on too." And so Ben Franklin walks out there, follows Washington's wife out to the outhouse, and they go in there and she's like, "Oh, Mr. Franklin." And he's like, "Yes, I can't hold it in any longer." And Martha Washington, Ben Franklin sitting next to each other awkwardly, pooping.
Who knows what happened out there? We went to John Tyler's house, and he had a 2-hole outhouse also.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. I
forget that what makes more sense.
The tour guide there said something about it. I forget what he said. Something about maybe, when you got to take your, little kids to the bathroom so you can, supervise them, but I don't know why.
You would feel the need to, pull down your pants and sit there, too. Yeah, I don't know. But for John Tyler, it makes more sense because he was a sex machine.
Yeah. He had 15 children, so there's probably always more than one person who has to go to the bathroom at the same time.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, that makes a little more sense.
Yeah,
but the Washington...
If George just was, into that.
Maybe.
He liked to watch when Martha went. Can't prove that didn't happen.
We kind of brought it up, but, was Washington infertile? Definitely. Was he impotent? We don't know.
I think he was laying pipe without consequences.
That's a distinct possibility. That's the thing. We don't know. It was, the result of smallpox?
Maybe.
Or did he... Yeah, I thought it was smallpox.
That's as best as we know. The only way we can almost assume that it's him and not Martha is that she had children in her first marriage.
Right. Could there be speculation that maybe something happened that she couldn't have kids, or...
Who knows? I don't think anybody...
Because
really
Washington
knows
wasn't, fucking around. He wasn't sleeping with all kinds of people.
Not that we know of.
No. Yeah.
So,
he's probably just a limp dick.
If you're in the D.C. area, make sure you stop by Mount Vernon. You and your traveling companion can take a dump at the same time.
You won't regret it either.
Live like a president.
Yeah, it's wild. It's an interesting place to visit. So, we're coming down to the end of our inaugural episode. So let's talk about the closing of Washington's life. His retirement and death.
Mm-hmm.
His retirement was not very long. About 2 years.
Yep, yeah, he died a little over 2 years
after a little over 2 years after he left. And it was... He got kind of a cold, surveying the grounds during a kind of winter squall.
Yep.
This would have been in December of 1799, and he was surveying the grounds, got caught in a winter squall, came back soaking wet, had dinner before he changed out of his clothes, developed the chill, started to go downhill from there. And then what we have is basically the sadistic murder of George Washington as his doctors proceed to bleed him to death.
Yeah. At least the incompetent hastening of his death.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, they
Yeah,
just
because like he
kept-
had basically a bad throat infection, and I know the doctors were like, one of them was like, "Hey, I heard about this thing, basically a tracheotomy," which is probably what they should have done, but none of them really
They were too
knew.
scared.
They didn't know how to do it or what it was, and they were reticent. Hey, this is the father of the country. Are we going to stab him in the neck?
yeah.
and probably be blamed if it goes bad.
If it goes bad, yeah, we're
Yeah.
probably get hung for treason or some shit.
Instead, we're just going to follow the medical state-of-the-art knowledge at the time and open his veins and let his blood out as if that's going to let out the fucking toxins in his system. That was the state of the medical profession at the time. And it left Washington weakened and less able to fight his infection.
Yeah. So he's being bled out, but he does have time for some final words, which I want to share now. And these were spoken to Tobias Lear, who you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into a vault in less than 2 days after I am dead. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, replied Lear. 'Tis well, said Washington. Washington had a fear of being buried alive.
Mm-hmm. I think that was kind of a common fear at the time.
It was. Yeah, they used to, they would tie string to people's fingers, and they'd have the bell up there so that if somebody like was just, yeah.
I wondered if it has something to do with like distrusting the doctors. Like
Maybe.
These people who think it's a good idea to bleed you, we don't trust them to say he's dead now.
Right.
They are often wrong. So give it a few days.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the end of George Washington.
That was it. He was. They cut a lock of his hair, and they stopped the clock at the time of his death. He had a mahogany coffin made with the Latin inscription Surge ad judicium gloria Deo, which I cannot translate for you.
I think the last part probably means glory to God.
Yeah, that would be my guess, but Surge ad judicium, I'm not sure.
If you know Latin, write into the podcast.
That's right. Yeah. Hit us up in the comments below.
You can become the official
Be
Latin
sure to like and
translator
subscribe.
of the podcast.
Be sure to like and subscribe.
Yeah, all listeners, take this
Leave
opportunity.
your comments below.
Take this opportunity to subscribe to the podcast. Get out your phone, hit subscribe. If you happen to be driving a car at the moment, look down at your phone. This is important. The road will still be there when you look back up.
It just takes 2 seconds.
Yeah.
What could happen in 2 seconds? Come on.
Come on.
Shit. And Jim, that about brings us to the end of our inaugural episode, but there's a couple little things that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
And that is a summation of Washington as a man and a president. Are we capable of summing up this man? And while we're at it, maybe we dispel a couple of myths and rumors about the man, too.
Yeah.
Common misconceptions that, liars teach our kids.
Yeah, one of the misconceptions is the popular story that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and then admitted it, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." That never happened.
No.
That was just simply made up out of whole cloth by one of his early biographers.
Yeah, the guy basically set to make him out to be the Jupiter Conservatoire, like there was he was trying to mold him into marble.
Yeah.
And that's like the image of Washington that we end up with today is often more marble than man.
Yeah.
And it's because of some of these early biographers that tried to paint this otherworldly
Mm-hmm.
image of perfection onto Washington,
Yeah.
where they almost like uh, gave him like a bit of a Christ treatment,
Yeah.
like where he couldn't fuck up.
Yeah, some of that I think is some of that image I think is Washington's own doing, because he always presented himself in a very restrained kind of
And dignified.
above the fray type manner, where
Yeah.
he had a temper that he would let loose sometimes among his intimates, and he also had a decent sense of humor that he could show to his friends.
Right.
But his public image was very austere and dignified, and that's kind of mostly what has come down, because most of the people at the time never knew the man behind the image.
Yeah. I think somewhere at one point I read that he forbade swearing in the army, but he would fly off the handle
Yeah.
occasionally.
Yeah, I know at the Battle of Monmouth, when Charles Lee retreated and Washington came up and was like, "What the hell are you doing?"
Yeah.
The eyewitness account said that Washington swore till he shook the leaves on the trees. And that was
and that's like,
that's his famous temper.
Look at the picture on the dollar bill and like picture that dude like flying off the handle.
Yeah.
Like obviously it's not gonna jive out because it's a later portrait, but I actually have some revelatory bombshell conspiracy news in regards to Washington, in regards to his portrait on the dollar bill.
Ooh.
Okay, so a lot of people, critics of Washington's portrait on the dollar bill, it's like, he looks like an old granny. Looks unimposing.
Mhm.
This is intentional. And very, very far-sighted. Because I didn't even realize it would happen. And not only with the dollar bill, but with the quarter. And, I mean, we're talking so far ahead of its time, it's unbelievable. Okay, let me get myself sorted here, because this is just so groundbreaking that I'm literally shaking. Like, oh man, I can't. I'm about to reveal this for the first time.
You've listened to the whole podcast. You think you know George Washington now.
But you're really about to learn something that is going to not only affect your entire belief system, but like your children's. And I mean, this is something that, like Santa Claus, it's one of those type myths. The Easter Bunny.
Mm-hmm.
What's another one?
The Tooth Fairy.
That's correct. Let's talk Washington's teeth.
Ooh.
Washington's teeth were not made of wood.
No.
We've seen them. We've seen them at Mount Vernon. I have photographs from different angles, like all over,
Yep.
of this bridge work and his teeth and everything, and no wood. You're talking ivory, just like a piano key is made from. Animal bone. Most importantly, the teeth from his slaves.
Yep.
That brings us to the bombshell. Are you ready? George Washington was the Tooth Fairy.
Whoa.
Yes. This is where it all started. Washington's teeth were not good. I mean, he had problems for a long time. His teeth, he needed to replace them. They used ivory, just like you see on the piano keys, bits of animal bone, what have you. But there's no substitute for the real deal, is there?
No.
What did Washington have quite a bit of? Slaves.
Yeah.
So what did he do?
One of them dies. That's a whole mouthful of teeth.
He had a more clever way of doing that. He wasn't trying to kill. He invented the story of the Tooth Fairy and said that any time you lose a tooth, if you leave it under your pillow, the tooth fairy will leave you a farthing. Wow. And so the slaves, they believed it. They would take out their own teeth and leave them under there. And maybe not George himself, although I like to think maybe, but he would have someone go in there and take the tooth and leave a farthing. And then Washington would have one new tooth, and
that explains so much.
It does. So that is how the tooth fairy became a thing, and also the image on the dollar bill is based off of the descriptions that different slaves of Washington had of this mystical tooth fairy.
Wow.
And of course the $1 bill wasn't printed till way down the road. So it was kind of like an inside kind of homage.
But nowadays, when the tooth fairy comes, what does, I thought she, but I guess what does he leave?
$1.
George Washington's calling card.
You get $1?
Mm-hmm.
And like even back in the day, it's like you'd get a quarter. Or maybe you'd get 50 cents.
Yeah.
You know? That was the beginning of the whole tooth fairy thing. It started with George Washington and his teeth.
That's incredible.
And his telling the slaves that, hey, you know, hey, in this new world here that you guys are kind of unfamiliar with, there is, you know, this mystical creature that when you happen to lose a tooth, like, don't worry about, like, bad dental hygiene, because if you lose your tooth and you put it under your pillow, you're going to get a farthing. And you can do with that farthing whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's how it all started.
It's George Washington's legacy.
Yeah, that among so many other things. What a powerful man. What an incredible president.
What an
giant. Important figure in American history, if not the most important figure. Probably the most important figure.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really any question about that. Obviously, the tooth fairy introduction is lighthearted. It kind of goes to show that, you know, Washington didn't personally mistreat his slaves. Obviously, he had slaves. That's terrible. That sucks. Slavery's wrong. Disclaimer, we hate it. We don't agree with slavery. Most presidents are racist. If not, well, the majority of presidents are racist. I mean, let's just get that out of the way up front in the first episode. We're going to be talking about a lot of slave-owning bigots. But, you know, it's sadly just the way people were brought up back then. And, like, thank goodness some of us know better now that we could, like, move beyond such fucking bullshit. But, like, I don't think it's fair for us to, like, rate Washington based on the fact that he owned a plantation in Virginia in the 1700s and had slaves working it. I mean, it sucks, but we're trying to rate the presidents, not, like, the people as presidents, which, you know, that's too bad, because if we were doing that, Jimmy Carter would be looked at better. You know, really.
Great guy. Yeah, sadly,
that's just the way it is.
Yeah, you know, Washington's a product of his time with slavery, and I think the real tragedy of it is that Washington and Jefferson and a lot of the prominent slave owners of the time knew and believed that slavery was wrong.
Right.
And they just, like, couldn't bring themselves to do anything about it.
They're making a lot of money, and they're not having to do any work themselves.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, yeah, to get rid of it, they would have to tank their own economy and source of wealth.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot
so
of them,
yeah, they were selfish white fucking assholes. a lot of them, and we're going to cover this so much that it's going to make you sick. So many of them just looked at it as like a necessary evil.
Yeah. I mean, it's a necessary evil in the sense that not doing anything about slavery at the founding and basically keeping silent on it was the price of union.
Yeah.
And that's what Washington thought about it. Like, he never spoke publicly against slavery because he knew that slavery was an issue that would jeopardize national unity.
Yeah, and maybe white folks were either too lazy or too, like, self-important to, like, do other white people's work for them.
Yeah.
And that much hasn't changed too much.
Like, we mentioned different times on the podcast how the Union was a tenuous thing, and, you know, for a lot of time people would think of Virginia as their country. If the northern states wanted to eliminate slavery in the South never would have joined the Union. So I guess slavery would have continued there maybe longer than it ended up doing. If silence on slavery was the price of the Union, at least eventually the Union is what ended slavery.
Yeah.
Washington...
It's just too bad that it didn't end... Well, just prejudice overall, but I mean, that's another story for another time.
Yeah,
we're at about we're close to the 3-hour mark on this inaugural podcast, so we're gonna wrap it up. Like, why don't we
end with a joke?
Yeah, I'd like to hear a joke.
Okay, how about this joke? What did the Marquis de Lafayette say when George Washington invited him to Mount Vernon?
I don't know. What?
Mount Vernon? I hardly know him.
That must have been one of the gay times at Mount Vernon. Let's give us a little shout out to our sponsors.
Yeah, guys, all the sponsors you've heard today, go out, patronize those products, and don't forget to be on the lookout for Joseph Bonsol's stolen horse.
Well, if they find her, maybe they could breed her with Dragon, huh?
Oh, that'd be a hell of a foal. You know, what with her being such a natural trotter and him being so many hands high?
I would sure take that horse for $3 and a bushel of oats, my friend.
I'd go as high as $4 on that.
This has been the inaugural episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast. Be sure to check us out on Twitter at
Dead Prez Podcast.
That's Prez.
Subscribe to the podcast, rate and review. That is, if you're going to give us a full 5 stars. If you didn't like the podcast, go suck an egg.
That's it, and make sure you hit the little subscription bell and like and comment below. And perhaps we'll even respond to you. We're going to close with a little number by a little band known as the Constitutionalists. This is George Washington. Thanks for listening, guys. Undertake not what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise. You men have virtue enough to withstand the highest bidder. When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. Be trampled on by individuals, as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberty. So it ought to be